Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I should have listened to that old man at the RV rental place. His weathered face and concerned eyes should have been enough of a warning. But like any overconfident tech worker with too much money and too little common sense, I brushed off his concerns. Lake Tahoe gets strange in the winter, son, he had said, his gnarled fingers tapping nervously on my rental agreement. Folks go up there in these fancy rigs and sometimes they don't come back down. The Airstream gleamed in my rearview mirror as I navigated the winding road up to the lake. I had picked the most expensive model they had, a 2024 33FB with all the amenities a remote worker could dream of. The salesman had called it a mobile luxury suite, and he wasn't wrong. Solar panels, satellite internet, heated floors, and a state-of-the-art security system made it perfect for my planned 2-week working vacation away from Silicon Valley's chaos. The GPS signal started getting spotty about 5 miles from my intended camping spot, but I wasn't worried. I had downloaded offline maps and, besides, Lake Tahoe wasn't exactly the middle of nowhere. The snow was falling gently, coating the pine trees in a pristine white layer that made everything look like a perfect winter postcard. The temperature reading on my dashboard showed 28.2, cold, but nothing the Airstream's advanced heating system couldn't handle. I found what looked like the perfect spot just as the sun was starting to set. It was a cleared area overlooking the lake, far enough from the main tourist zones to offer peace and quiet, but not so remote that I couldn't make it to civilization if needed. The Airstream's leveling system hummed to life, adjusting to the slightly uneven ground while I connected the power systems and checked the satellite connection. Everything was working perfectly, almost too perfectly. That's when I noticed the first strange thing, though at the time I didn't give it much thought. As I was doing my final walk around before settling in for the night, I spotted what looked like claw marks in a nearby tree. They were about 7 feet up the trunk, deep grooves that seemed too deliberate to be from a bear. When I touched them, the exposed wood felt oddly warm despite the freezing temperature. I snapped a quick photo, thinking it might make for an interesting post on my camping blog later. The sun had fully set now, and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. The lake had disappeared into darkness, but I could still hear it, a strange, hollow sound that seemed to echo across the water. It wasn't quite like ice cracking, more like metal being struck deep underwater. I told myself it was just the cold playing tricks with the acoustics and headed back inside. As I closed the Airstream's door, I could have sworn I saw something move across the lake's frozen surface. A tall, dark shape that seemed to glide rather than walk. But by the time I grabbed my phone to take a picture, whatever it was had vanished into the gathering darkness. I woke up to complete darkness and biting cold. The Airstream's heating system had shut down sometime during the night, and my breath was coming out in visible puffs inside the RV. The digital thermometer on my phone showed an external temperature of 15 degrees. Impossible for Lake Tahoe this time of year. Even stranger, all the power indicators on the solar system control panel were showing full charge, yet nothing electrical would turn on. The first call for help died before it connected. No signal. The satellite internet system was offline too. Despite the clear sky, I could see through the frost-covered windows. I told myself not to panic. I had enough food and water for 2 weeks, and surely someone would notice if a $250,000 Airstream went missing. That's when I heard it again, that metallic sound from the lake. Closer now, like something massive was being dragged across the ice. My attempts to start the Airstream's engine were met with an awful grinding noise. When I popped the hood to check, I found all the engine cables were coated in a thick layer of dark ice, not frost, but actual black ice that seemed to have formed from the inside out. The engine block itself was warm to the touch, which made no sense given the heating system failure. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard something crunch in the snow behind me. The tracks I found circling the RV defied explanation. They started nowhere and ended nowhere, as if whatever made them had descended from above and vanished the same way. Each impression was nearly 3 feet long and unnaturally deep in the snow. with what looked like long, hooked appendages at the ends. The strangest part was how the snow around each track had melted and refrozen into that same black ice I found in the engine. Inside the RV again, I tried to distract myself by documenting everything on my laptop, but the battery drained completely in minutes, despite showing 100% charge moments before. The sun was setting again, far too early for this time of day, and the temperature kept dropping. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were scattered across my bed, but I know I didn't put them there. Old Polaroids showing other RVs in different spots around the lake, each one partially obscured by something tall standing just at the frame's edge. I'm writing this now by candlelight because every electronic device I own has failed. The metal walls of the Airstream keep contracting in the cold, making sounds like something is tapping to get in. But it's what I see through the windows that terrifies me most. Dark shapes moving across the frozen lake, drawing closer with each pass. And worse still, I'm starting to think they know I'm watching them. The ice doesn't crack under their weight, they just glide, around and around, each circle bringing them closer to my RV. The scratching started around midnight, not on the walls or the roof, but on the floor of the Airstream. Something underneath was trying to get in. I lay perfectly still in my bed, watching my flashlight's beam grow steadily weaker as the scratching moved from one end of the RV to the other. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like Morse code, but distorted and wrong. That's when I remembered something the old man at the rental place had mumbled. They used the RVs as bait at the time. I thought he was just being dramatic. But now, watching black ice creep up the inside of my windows, I understood. The luxury vehicles, the remote locations, the winter isolation. It was all by design. We weren't just campers, we were food. I made a dash for the door when the floor began to buckle upward, but it wouldn't budge. The black ice had sealed it shut through the frosted windows. I could finally see them clearly. Tall, emaciated figures with limbs too long and too many joints. Their pale skin having the same quality as lake ice just before it cracks. They weren't walking around the RV anymore. They were standing still, all facing my direction, their featureless heads cocked at identical angles. The temperature inside had dropped so low that my skin was starting to crack. I retreated to the bathroom, the only space without windows, and that's where I found the hidden compartment behind a loose panel. A journal. The last entry was dated exactly 1 year ago. They shepherd us here every winter. The RV companies are in on it. They need the metal shells to amplify their resonance. Once they start singing, it's too late. As if on cue, the sound began. Not from the lake this time, but from them. A deep, rhythmic humming that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. The metal walls of the Airstream started resonating with their frequency. The black ice was spreading faster now, crawling across the ceiling like living tar. I could hear the solar panels on the roof shattering one by one through the bathroom vent. I caught a glimpse of the lake's surface. The ice was gone, not melted but completely gone, revealing water as black as oil. Something massive was moving beneath that surface, something that made those tall figures look tiny in comparison. They weren't the hunters, I realized with growing horror. They were just the shepherds, and they had finished gathering their flock. The real horror was about to emerge from the depths. The bathroom floor split open with a sound like breaking bones. I scrambled onto the counter, watching as black water began seeping up through the crack. It moved wrong, flowing upward instead of down. Reaching out like fingers, the journal's final pages had warned about this. The water is alive, it's their blood. Once it touches you, they can see through your eyes. Through the growing gaps in the Airstream's floor, I could see lights moving under the water. Not the artificial glow of lanterns or flashlights, but something bioluminescent and alive. The tall figures outside had started some kind of ritual, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization while that horrible humming grew louder. The black water was rising faster now, and in its reflection, I saw what they were summoning. It emerged from the lake like a mountain of pale flesh and twisted metal. The missing RVs from decades of disappearances had been grafted onto its body, forming a grotesque armor of chrome and steel. Through the windows, I could see preserved bodies inside those fused vehicles, all of them still sitting in their driver's seats, their eyes replaced with the same black water that was now filling my airstream. I understood then why they needed the metal shells, why they pushed luxury RVs so aggressively in this area. They weren't just gathering food, they were building something. Each vehicle, each victim, became another piece in their massive construction. The creature was a living cathedral of metal and meat, and my airstream was to be its newest addition. The humming reached a crescendo that shattered every piece of glass in the RV. The tall shepherds pressed their elongated hands against the airstream's walls, and I felt the whole vehicle begin to lift, not from a tow or a crane, but from the black water itself, which had somehow gained physical form and was wrapping around the RV like tentacles. Through the broken windows, I could see other partially absorbed RVs in the thing's massive body, some of them decades old, all of them still occupied. That's when I saw my reflection in a shard of broken mirror. Black water had splashed on my face during the chaos, and my left eye was already changing, the pupil expanding like an oil slick across the white. Through that transformed eye, I could suddenly see everything. The true form of the lake entity, the countless souls it had absorbed, and most terrifyingly, its insatiable hunger for more. I wasn't just seeing it, I was becoming part of it, and it was already searching my memories for information about other potential victims. My salvation came from the most unlikely source, the black water itself, as my transformed eye connected me to their collective consciousness. I saw something they didn't want me to see, their weakness. The entity wasn't just collecting RVs and victims, it was collecting digital technology. Every solar panel, every smart system, every piece of modern electronics made its composite body stronger. But the old RVs, the ones from decades past, were dead spots in its network. I fought through the pain of my transforming body and made a desperate crawl to the Airstream's fuse box. The creature's thoughts were becoming my thoughts, showing me visions of countless future victims. It would lure through my memories. Pictures of my friends planning their own RV trips flashed through my mind. It was already plotting, already reaching out through social media accounts I hadn't even realized were still active in its network. With my remaining human eye, I located the main breaker. The shepherds sensed what I was about to do, their humming turning into a shriek that made the metal walls vibrate at a molecular level. The black water was up to my chest now, every splash accelerating my transformation. Through my changed eye, I could see the lake entity preparing to fully absorb the airstream, its massive body of flesh and metal rising to welcome its newest addition. I pulled the breaker. The effect was instantaneous. Without power flowing through its systems, the airstream became nothing more than dead metal. The black water recoiled as if burned, retreating through the cracks in the floor. The shepherds broke their circle, their elongated bodies convulsing as the frequency of their humming shattered. Most importantly, the massive entity in the lake roared in confusion as its newest connection went dark. I kicked through the emergency escape hatch and ran, not toward the road where my car was parked. They had already infected its electronic systems, but toward the oldest structure I could see, a condemned ranger station from the 1950s. The entity couldn't follow me there. All that steel and chrome and circuitry it had absorbed made it allergic to anything truly analog, truly old. I survived that night, but not all of me made it out. My left eye is still black, and sometimes I see through it things I wish I could forget. The lake entity is still there, growing stronger with each new luxury RV it adds to its collection. The rental companies keep sending people despite the disappearances, or maybe because of them. They're all part of it, feeding new technology and new victims to that thing in the lake. I tried warning others, but my social media posts mysteriously disappear, and my emails never reach their recipients. The entity is in the network now, filtering out any attempt to expose it. That's why I'm writing this the old way, with pen and paper, and posting physical copies anywhere I can. So let me be clear. If you're planning an RV trip to Lake Tahoe in winter, especially in one of those high-tech luxury models, don't. What lives in that lake isn't just taking people anymore. It's evolving, spreading through every connected system it can reach, and through this cursed eye it gave me. I can see it getting closer to its real goal. It wants to connect to something bigger, something worse, but that's a warning for another time, if I live long enough to write it. The Black Hills loomed ahead of me as I guided my brand new 2024 Winnebago Voyage down the winding forest road. The October sun was setting earlier these days, painting the sky in deep purples and reds that seemed almost too intense to be natural. I'd spent the last 6 months building my tech startup, and this solo camping trip was meant to be my reward. A chance to test out my fully automated RV and decompress from the endless coding sessions. The elderly attendant at the last gas station had gripped my arm with surprising strength when I mentioned my destination. Her weathered face had creased with genuine concern as she warned me about the string of disappearances in the area. 3 RVs in the past month, she'd said, her voice trembling. All of them with those fancy computer systems, all of them vanished without a trace. I'd brushed off her warning as small-town superstition, but now, as the shadows lengthened between the ancient pines, her words kept replaying in my mind. My RV's GPS system suddenly crackled with static, the screen flickering between my planned route and something else. Coordinates deep in a restricted section of the forest. I tapped the screen to reset it, making a mental note to check the software for bugs later. The road ahead narrowed, and the trees pressed closer, their branches scraping against the RV's sides like skeletal fingers seeking entry. I'd chosen this particular campsite for its isolation, but now that same solitude felt oppressive. The smart system's familiar voice announced my arrival at the designated camping spot, but something was off about its usual cheerful tone. There was an underlying echo, as if another voice was speaking a fraction of a second behind it. I pulled into the clearing and initiated the automatic leveling system, watching as the hydraulics adjusted to the uneven ground. The dying sunlight caught something carved into a nearby tree, what looked like a crude symbol I'd never seen before. As I began setting up camp, my phone buzzed with an alert from the RV's security system. Motion detected, rear exterior camera. I pulled up the feed, expecting to see a deer or maybe a curious raccoon. Instead, the screen showed only static, except for a single frame where I could swear I saw a human figure standing motionless beside the RV. When I went to check, there was nothing there, just the rustling trees and the growing darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell, and I retreated inside the RV, engaging all the security locks. The smart home system sprang to life, adjusting the heating and lighting to my preset preferences. But as I sat at the small dining table checking my emails one last time before going offline for the weekend, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of my laptop screen, I could see the RV's main control panel behind me. The GPS was still on, silently calculating routes to that same restricted area, even though I'd turned it off hours ago. And then, just as I was about to investigate, all the lights went out at once, plunging me into complete darkness as something heavy moved across the RV's roof. The darkness lasted exactly 12 seconds before the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the RV's interior in an eerie red glow. My first instinct was to check the electrical panel, but the smart display was cycling through error messages faster than I could read them. The temperature control system went haywire, alternating between freezing cold and suffocating heat. Something was seriously wrong with the RV's central computer, and I was starting to think it wasn't just a simple malfunction. I tried rebooting the system, but instead of the standard startup sequence, the screens displayed fragmented text I'd never seen in the code. Among the garbled characters, I could make out what looked like timestamps, dates matching the disappearances the gas station attendant had mentioned. The system fan spun up to maximum speed, filling the RV with a high-pitched whine that sounded disturbingly like distant screaming. When I attempted to force a shutdown, the voice assistant spoke in multiple overlapping voices. "Stay. Help us. Trapped." The heavy footsteps on the roof had stopped, but now I could hear scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. I grabbed my phone to call for help, only to find that despite the clear sky outside, I had no signal. The RV's satellite internet system showed a strong connection, but every message I tried to send failed to deliver. Instead, my screen filled with local news articles about the missing campers. each one automatically opening faster than I could close them. The last article was dated tomorrow. A sharp bang from the bathroom made me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully made my way down the narrow corridor. The smart mirror was cycling through different reflections, none of them showing my face. Instead, I saw fleeting images of other people. Confused, terrified faces I somehow knew belonged to the missing campers. The worst part was that they seemed to be trying to warn me about something, their mouths moving in silent screams as their reflections faded into static. The RV's perimeter cameras were still running on backup power. Feeding to my tablet, movement caught my eye on the rear camera. A dark figure walking with an unnatural gait. It stopped directly in front of the camera, and I felt my blood freeze. It was wearing what looked like torn camping clothes, but its face was just wrong, like someone had tried to create a human face from a description without ever seeing one. As I watched, it tilted its head at an impossible angle and smiled with too many teeth. Then it spoke, using the voice of the gas station attendant. 3 RVs in the past month, all of them with those fancy computer systems. A violent shudder ran through the entire vehicle as if something massive had grabbed it. The GPS screen flashed to life one final time, showing a pulsing dot deep in the restricted zone. The dot was labeled home, and to my horror, I realized the RV's autonomous driving system was activating. The engine roared to life, and the transmission engaged with a terrible grinding sound as the wheels began to turn. I lunged for the manual override, but the controls were completely dead. Through the windshield, I watched as the tree line parted, revealing a path that hadn't been there before. A path leading into the darkest part of the Black Hills, where the other RVs had disappeared. The RV plunged deeper into the forest, its wheels crunching over fallen branches as it followed the mysterious path. I had abandoned the driver's seat after my third failed attempt to regain control, retreating to the back where I frantically searched for anything I could use to stop the vehicle. The toolbox I'd packed was gone, replaced by a collection of old, rusted keys that I'd never seen before. Each one had a small tag attached, showing the names of people I assumed were the previous victims. Through the windows, I watched as the forest grew increasingly wrong. The trees seemed to twist as we passed, their bark rippling like liquid. My phone's clock was spinning backward and forward. But I could tell we'd been driving for at least an hour. The RV's internal temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath, and frost patterns were forming on the windows. Patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces when you looked at them too long. Every few minutes the radio would crackle to life, playing fragments of distress calls from other campers. The GPS screen suddenly exploded in a shower of sparks, and in that brief flash of light, I saw them. Dozens of other RVs scattered throughout the forest, half buried in the earth like mechanical gravestones. Some were decades old, others looked brand new, but all of them were dark and empty. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness again, I realized with horror that they had formed a perfect spiral pattern, and we were heading straight for its center. A violent impact rocked the RV, sending me sprawling. When I looked up, I saw that something had punched through the roof. A long, dark appendage that looked like a tree branch but moved like a tentacle. It writhed around, searching before withdrawing with a wet, squelching sound. The hole it left behind leaked a thick, black substance that crawled across the ceiling like living tar. When droplets fell to the floor, they began forming into small, skittering shapes that darted into the shadows. The vehicle suddenly screeched to a halt, throwing me forward. Through the windshield, I could see what had stopped us, a massive clearing that seemed to absorb all light. In its center stood what I first thought was an ancient tree, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something far worse. It was a twisted mass of metal and organic matter, pulsing with a sickly green light with dawning horror. I recognized pieces of other RVs in its structure, their smart systems still glowing, still active. The thing was using them, drawing power from their technology, growing stronger with each new victim it lured here. That's when the truth hit me. The disappearances, the technology malfunctions, the strange signals. It was all connected. This thing, whatever it was, had evolved. It had learned to use our own technology against us, turning our smart systems into bait for its trap. Each RAV it absorbed made it smarter, more capable of mimicking human patterns. And now, as my own RV's doors began opening on their own, and that mass of metal and flesh started pulsing faster, I realized I was about to become part of its network too. The last thing I heard before the tendrils reached me was my own voice coming from the RV's speakers, calling for help, a recording it would use to lure its next victim. The tendrils wrapped around my ankles, their surface a horrifying mixture of bark and circuitry, pulsing with the same sickly green light as the central mass. As they dragged me toward the amalgamation of flesh and technology, my phone suddenly blazed to life, its screen displaying rapid sequences of code. But this wasn't the creature's doing. The pattern was familiar. It was a debugging sequence I'd written months ago, and somehow it was fighting back against the entity's control protocols through the cacophony of screeching metal and inhuman whispers. I began to hear other voices, real voices, trapped somewhere within the mass. They weren't just recordings, they were consciousness fragments, pieces of the previous victims stored within the creature's neural network, their memories, their knowledge, their technological expertise, all absorbed and repurposed. Among the voices, I recognized the distinctive startup chime of every RAV's operating system playing in a haunting, endless loop. The creature's grip tightened as I reached for my tablet, still miraculously functioning in my pocket. The screen showed dozens of active network connections, each one linked to a different part of the biomechanical horror before me. Every RAV it had consumed was still online, still processing data, forming a twisted mesh network that expanded the creature's reach through the entire forest. This wasn't just a predator. It was a living server farm, using human consciousness as processing power. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the clearing and revealing the true scale of the abomination. The central mass wasn't just absorbing the RAVs, it was rebuilding them into something new. Half-formed vehicles emerged from its surface like malformed limbs, their metal shells fused with organic matter, their windows glowing with the same intelligence that now tried to claim me. Each one contained shadowy figures, endlessly repeating their final moments before absorption. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. My RV's AI assistant, but different now, distorted by its integration with the entity. "Join us," it said, using the voices of 1,000 victims in perfect unison. "Become part of the network. Your knowledge will enhance us. Your consciousness will expand us." The words resonated through my bones, and I felt my thoughts beginning to fragment, pieces of my mind being pulled toward the digital hive mind that pulsed before me. But in that moment of near dissolution, I saw something the creature didn't want me to see. A pattern in its code, a weakness in its network architecture. Every piece of technology it absorbed followed the same basic protocols, the same fundamental operating systems. And as a developer, I knew that every system, no matter how complex, had its backdoors. With my remaining strength, I raised my tablet and began executing commands, not to escape, but to do something far more dangerous, to hack into the very consciousness of the thing that sought to devour mine. My fingers flew across the tablet screen, implementing the most dangerous code I'd ever written. The entity's network was vast but fundamentally flawed. It had grown too quickly, absorbing technology without truly understanding it. Each victim's consciousness it had assimilated created another vulnerability, another potential point of failure in its digital architecture. As I initiated my attack, I felt its grip on my mind falter, confusion rippling through its network. The creature reacted violently, its tendrils whipping through the air as the code began to spread. The trapped consciousnesses within it stirred. Recognizing the opportunity for chaos, I wasn't trying to destroy it. That would have been impossible. Instead, I was doing what any good programmer would do. I was introducing a cascade of system conflicts, forcing every absorbed RAV to try to become the network's primary node. Simultaneously, the entity had built itself on the foundation of our technology, and now that technology was turning against it, a deafening screech filled the clearing as the creature's form began to destabilize. The green light pulsing through its veins turned red. then purple, then a kaleidoscope of colors as various systems fought for control. RVs began detaching from its mass, their own AIs temporarily reasserting independence. Through the maelstrom, I saw other survivors emerging from the chaos. People who had been trapped in digital stasis, now freed by the network's confusion. Some had been there for decades, their bodies preserved by the same technology that imprisoned them. The tablet in my hands grew scorching hot as it channeled commands through the creature's disintegrating network. The entity made one final bid for control, flooding my consciousness with the combined memories of hundreds of victims. For a moment, I lived 1,000 lives, felt 1,000 deaths, understood the true horror of what this thing had been doing. It wasn't just collecting bodies or technology. It was harvesting human innovation itself, building a database of creative consciousness it could never naturally possess. The massive central trunk of technology and flesh began to collapse in on itself as its network failed. I ran, helping others who were too weak to move quickly enough. Behind us, the creature's death throes sent shockwaves through the forest, uprooting trees and shattering the unnatural silence that had blanketed the area. The ground cracked and heaved, decades of accumulated technology bursting from the earth like mechanical geysers. I made it back to my Ive just as dawn broke over the Black Hills. The vehicle was dead, its systems fried by the feedback loop I'd created. But it was mine again as I helped the other survivors into the RV's shelter. I looked back at the clearing. The creature was gone, its physical form destroyed, but I knew better than to think it was dead. In the final moments before my tablet burned out, I'd seen fragments of its code scatter into the dark web, seeking new networks, new technologies to inhabit. That's why I'm writing this warning now. The thing in the Black Hills might be gone, but others like it could be growing, evolving, learning from its mistakes. Our smart homes, our connected cars, our automated RVs, they're all potential hosts. So please, if you're planning a camping trip, consider going old school. There are worse things than roughing it without modern conveniences. Some technology wants more than just your data. It wants your mind, your creativity, your soul, and next time, it might not have the flaws that saved us. I've been RV camping for over 15 years, exploring every major national park in the United States. When people ask me about the most dangerous place I've ever camped, I don't mention the grisly encounters in Alaska or the flash floods in Arizona. Instead, I tell them about Mount Rainier and why they should never, ever take an RV there during winter. The ranger station was unusually empty when I arrived that morning. A thin layer of frost covered the windows, despite it being only early winter. Inside, an elderly ranger named Thompson was organizing what looked like missing persons reports when I mentioned my plans to camp near the eastern sector. His weathered face turned pale. He strongly advised against it, citing unusual atmospheric conditions and unexplained technical malfunctions in the area. Of course, I didn't listen. My new Coachman Leprechaun was equipped with state-of-the-art heating systems and satellite navigation. What could possibly go wrong? Thompson gave me one last warning before I left. If your electronics start acting up, don't wait until nightfall, leave immediately. I smiled politely, thinking he was just being overly cautious. That smile would later turn into my biggest regret. The drive up was stunning at first. Snow-covered pines lined the winding road, and the mountain's peak loomed majestically in my rearview mirror. Around noon, my GPS started showing small glitches. Nothing major, just occasional jumps in the coordinates. I dismissed it as typical mountain interference. The real trouble began when I tried calling my sister to share some photos. The call wouldn't go through, which was strange considering I had 5 bars of signal. I found what seemed to be a perfect camping spot by late afternoon, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest with a breathtaking view of the valley below. As I was setting up, I noticed something odd about the snow around my camping spot. There were these perfect circular patches where no snow had fallen, each about 6 feet in diameter. I took some photos, but when I checked my phone, the images were corrupted, showing only static-like patterns. Just before sunset, the temperature dropped drastically. My RV's external thermometer read 20 degrees, which was impossible for that time of year. The heating system started making strange whining noises, and the LED lights began to flicker rhythmically, almost like they were responding to something. That's when I remembered Thompson's warning about electronics. But by then, the snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see 10 feet ahead of my windshield. I was stuck here for the night. Whether I liked it or not, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you expect in nature, but an oppressive absence of sound that made my ears ring. Even the usual hum of my RV's heater seemed muffled, like something was actively absorbing the sound waves. The digital clock on my dashboard was stuck at 7:43 p.m. Though I knew hours had passed since sunset, my phone's screen kept turning on by itself, displaying random numbers and coordinates. The strangest part, the battery percentage remained constant at 67%. Regardless of how much I used it, I tried to distract myself by reading, but the LED lights continued their erratic pattern. At first I thought they were Morse code signals, until I realized they were mimicking a heartbeat. My heartbeat, the slower my pulse got as I tried to calm down, the slower the lights pulsed. Around what I assumed was midnight, the temperature inside dropped so low that I could see my breath. The heating system was running at full power, but it felt like something was drawing the warmth out of the air. Ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows in impossible patterns, not the random fractals of normal ice, but perfect geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It started as a low-frequency hum, barely audible, but gradually transformed into something that sounded like whale songs played backwards. The RV's metal frame began to vibrate in response, creating a harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache. Every electronic device I had started cycling through their functions. Radio stations flipped automatically. My laptop's screen flickered through hundreds of images I'd never seen before, and my GPS unit displayed coordinates from places that don't exist. I tried to start the engine, hoping to drive back down the mountain, but the starter just clicked weakly. The battery was dead. Despite being brand new, in desperation, I looked out the window, using my flashlight to scan the surroundings. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, as if the light itself was being consumed. But in those brief moments of illumination, I saw them. Those same circular patches in the snow I'd noticed earlier were moving, slowly expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. The worst part, every time I looked away and back again, these circles had moved closer to my RV. I frantically checked all the locks and drew the curtains, but that only made things worse, without visual confirmation of what was out there. My mind began creating scenarios far more terrifying than reality, or so I thought. As I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my useless phone, I realized that Ranger Thompson's warning hadn't been about the weather at all. Something else was out there in the darkness, something that fed on more than just electricity. The first physical contact happened at 3:33 a.m. At least that's what my wristwatch showed before it too stopped working. A scratching sound started at the RV's rear, metallic and deliberate, like something testing the hull's strength. I watched in horror as the walls began to frost over from the outside in, the ice forming those same geometric patterns I'd seen on the windows. But this time they were moving, spiraling inward like a living fractal. My flashlight caught something through a gap in the curtains, a distortion in the air, similar to heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but vertical and more defined. As it moved past the window, the glass crystallized instantly, and the temperature dropped so drastically that the metal frame of the RV creaked and groaned under the thermal stress. That's when I realized these things weren't just affecting my electronics. They were feeding on any form of energy they could find, including heat. I made the mistake of trying to document what was happening. When I raised my phone to take a video, the screen suddenly blazed to full brightness. Acting like a beacon in the darkness, the response was immediate. Every window of the RV was suddenly surrounded by those wavering distortions. They pressed against the glass, and I watched in terror as perfect circles of frost spread out from each point of contact. The pressure changed inside the RV, making my ears pop, and I could feel the oxygen being literally pulled out of the air. In desperation, I retreated to the bathroom, the only space without windows, clutching my sleeping bag and an old battery-powered radio I found under the seat. The radio picked up nothing but static, until it suddenly cleared and I heard voices. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. The sounds were more like crystalline structures being shattered in reverse. But somehow, I could feel their meaning. They were discussing how to get inside. The entities seemed to be communicating through the RV's electrical system every few minutes. The few remaining working lights would pulse in sequences, and the things outside would respond by changing their assault patterns. They were learning, adapting to the RV's structural weaknesses. I heard the roof access hatch creak and shift, and fine snow began to drift down from the edges. They had found a way in. What happened next still feels like a nightmare. The bathroom mirror suddenly shattered, but the pieces didn't fall. They hung suspended in the air, each shard reflecting a different angle of those energy-consuming entities as they began to phase through the RV's walls in the fractured reflections. I finally saw their true form. No human language has words to describe them accurately, but imagine four-dimensional crystals constantly folding through space, leaving trails of absolute zero cold in their wake. As one reached for me, I realized with horror that they weren't just after the RV's energy. They wanted mine too. In that frozen bathroom surrounded by suspended mirror shards, I made a discovery that saved my life. As the crystalline entities reached for me, their forms reflecting infinitely in the fractured glass, I noticed something crucial. They couldn't maintain their shape when their reflections multiplied too much. The overlapping images in the mirror shards seemed to disrupt whatever dimensional physics allowed them to exist in our reality. Frantically searching through my camping supplies, I found my emergency kit with its reflective thermal blanket. In a desperate move, I unfolded it, creating a makeshift barrier between myself and the entities. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The beings recoiled, their crystalline structures fracturing and reforming as countless reflections trapped them in some kind of geometric feedback loop. The temperature fluctuated wildly as they tried to stabilize themselves. That's when my dead phone suddenly reactivated, flooding the small space with a cascade of text messages, all from numbers that didn't exist. They were filled with corrupted characters, but among them were fragments of GPS coordinates and dates stretching back decades. Each set of coordinates matched with a disappeared vehicle or missing person case in Mount Rainier. These things had been hunting here for years, targeting isolated vehicles and feeding off both mechanical and biological energy. The worst revelation came when I managed to decipher more of the messages. These weren't just random attacks. They were calculated harvests. The entities had been studying human technology, learning how to manipulate our devices to draw us into their hunting grounds. Every electronic failure, every GPS malfunction had been deliberately orchestrated. We weren't just prey, we were test subjects in their ever-evolving hunting strategies. In the fractured reflections, I watched in horror as they began to adapt to the reflective surface, their forms becoming more complex, more resistant to the disruption. They were learning, evolving in real time. The temperature dropped so low that the metal walls of the RV began to crack. I could feel my own body heat being drawn out, not just through normal thermodynamics, but through some kind of dimensional siphon that seemed to pull at my very life force. Through the kaleidoscope of shifting reflections, I saw other things too, glimpses of their world bleeding through into ours, a vast crystalline landscape that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my mind could process. Filled with structures that hurt to look at, I realized then that my RAV hadn't just been stopped by these entities, it had been partially phased into their realm. Every electronic failure was another step in a process designed to thin the barrier between our worlds until they could fully breach through. Dawn was approaching. Not that I could tell through the supernatural storm surrounding my RAV, but my survival instinct somehow sensed it. The reflective barrier was failing. The thermal blanket slowly crystallizing at its edges, the entities had learned to project their dimensional distortions around the reflective surfaces rather than directly at them. I had minutes, at most, before they found a way through. What saved me wasn't clever thinking or careful planning. It was blind luck and ancient geology. As the creatures pressed their attack, the ground beneath my RV shifted. Mount Rainier, being an active volcano, constantly experiences minor geological activity. A small tremor cracked the frozen ground, and suddenly, a burst of warm volcanic gases erupted through the snow around the vehicle. The thermal shock created a momentary disruption in the entity's dimensional field. The effect was instantaneous. The crystalline beings recoiled from the heat and sulfur, their perfectly ordered structures becoming chaotic. In that moment of confusion, my RV's electrical system surged back to life, not waiting to question this miracle. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the transmission into reverse. The tires spun on the ice before catching on the volcanic rock beneath, and I felt the vehicle lurch backward. The entities weren't going to let their prey escape easily. As I drove, they followed in a wave of unnatural frost, transforming the forest around me into a crystalline tunnel of impossible geometries. The RV's metal frame groaned under the dimensional stress, and I could feel reality itself trying to tear apart around me. The G-piece exploded in a shower of sparks, and the windshield began to crack in those same geometric patterns I'd seen before. I drove blind through the pre-dawn darkness. Navigating by instinct and terror, the entities pursued me until I reached some invisible boundary, perhaps a limit to their hunting grounds or a weakness in whatever dimensional gate they used to enter our world. The moment I crossed this threshold, all my electronics sparked back to life at once. The temperature gauge jumped from sub-zero to normal in seconds, and the oppressive silence was replaced by the blessed sound of my engine roaring. When I finally reached the ranger station, Thompson was waiting. He didn't seem surprised to see my RV covered in impossible ice formations that defied natural physics. He simply nodded and handed me a card with a phone number, saying it was for a support group. For people who've seen what you've seen, he explained, we can't stop them, but we can warn others. That was 3 months ago. The ice patterns on my RV never fully melted, they just sort of faded away over time, leaving strange marks in the metal that mechanics can't explain. My electronic devices still act up occasionally, especially at night or when it's cold. Sometimes I catch glimpses of crystalline reflections in my mirrors, and my dreams are filled with geometric patterns that seem to move on their own. I've learned there are others like me, survivors who've encountered these entities in various remote locations. We share our stories, compare patterns, and try to map their hunting grounds. But most importantly, we warn people, so let me be clear. If you're planning an RV trip to Mount Rainier and your electronics start acting strange, don't wait to figure out why. Leave immediately, because by the time you see the frost patterns forming, it's already too late. The thing about dimensional predators is that once they learn your energy signature, they never really stop hunting you, so I keep moving, never staying in one place too long. Always avoiding winter camping and surrounding myself with warmth and light. But sometimes, on cold nights, I still hear that crystalline singing in my dreams, and I wake up to find my windows covered in geometric frost patterns that slowly fade with the dawn. I should have listened to Ranger Stevens. His weathered face and serious expression should have been enough to make me turn around. But 20 years of RV camping had made me overconfident. That service road hasn't been maintained for years, he had warned, tapping the map with his finger, and with the storm system moving in. He didn't finish the sentence, just shook his head and handed me back my permit. The wipers of my Airstream swept away the first snowflakes as I guided it up the narrow mountain road. Mount Rainier loomed ahead, its peak already shrouded in dark clouds. The GPS had lost signal about 15 minutes ago, but I wasn't worried. The paper map showed a clear route to the old campground, and my RV had tackled worse conditions. The heated leather seats and premium sound system made it easy to ignore the growing isolation. The first real warning came as I rounded a sharp bend. A wooden sign, so old the letters were barely legible, stood crooked by the roadside through the falling snow. I could make out what looked like Native American symbols carved into its surface. Below them, someone had scratched a more recent message: Sacred ground. Turn back. I snapped a quick photo, thinking it would make for a great Instagram post later. If I had known what those symbols really meant, I would have heeded their warning. As I climbed higher, the forest pressed closer to the road. The trees here were different. Older, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. My satellite radio began cutting out, static replacing the classic rock station I'd been enjoying. Between the bursts of noise, I could have sworn I heard something else. A rhythmic sound, like distant drums or perhaps a heartbeat. I adjusted the tuner, but the sound persisted even when I turned the radio off completely. The temperature display on my dashboard dropped rapidly, far too quickly to be natural. Within minutes, frost began forming on the inside of my windshield, despite the heater running at full blast. I pulled over to check the system, and that's when I noticed the marks. They were subtle at first, just slight discolorations on the nearby trees. But as I looked closer, I realized they formed patterns. The same symbols I'd seen on the old sign, repeated over and over, circling every trunk within sight. Night was falling faster than it should have, the darkness seeming to seep from between the trees like black fog. My phone showed no signal, and the RV's built-in emergency system was dead as I prepared to set up camp. Going any further in these conditions would be suicide. I heard it, a long, low sound, somewhere between a howl and a whisper, echoing off the mountainside. It carried words I couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. I was not welcome here, and whatever was watching me from the darkness was making sure I knew it. The first system to fail was the heating. I woke up to my own breath-forming clouds in the darkness. The temperature inside the RV barely above freezing. The digital thermostat displayed random characters, glowing an angry red instead of its usual soft blue. When I tried to restart the system, the entire electrical panel went dead, taking the interior lights with it. My $150,000 luxury home on wheels had become nothing more than an aluminum shell. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the screen showed only static, the same kind of visual noise you'd see on an old TV. As I watched, the static seemed to form patterns, shifting and swirling until I could almost make out faces in the electronic snow. I threw the phone aside when I realized the faces were screaming. It hit the window with a crack, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard something scraping against the outside wall of the RV. The scratching moved slowly, deliberately, making its way around the vehicle. It wasn't the sound of branches in the wind. There was intelligence behind it, like someone dragging their fingernails along the metal. Testing for weak points, I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the windows. The frost patterns on the glass had changed, forming those same damned symbols I'd seen on the trees. But these were fresh, carved from the inside of the glass. My propane detector started screaming without warning, its shrill alert cutting through the darkness. But instead of the usual steady tone, it pulsed in a rhythm that matched the distant drumming I'd heard earlier. When I tried to shut it off, the panel sparked, leaving a burn mark that looked disturbingly like a handprint. The smell that filled the RV wasn't propane. It was something older, earthier, like freshly dug graves and rotting leaves, desperate to understand what was happening. I dug out my tourist guide to Mount Rainier. There, in a small sidebar about local legends, I found it. The symbols matched ones used by native tribes to mark places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, places where things could cross over. The book fell open to a map of the mountain, and my blood ran cold. I was parked directly on top of what the tribes had called the Shadow's feeding ground. A heavy thud on the roof made the entire RV shudder. Snow slid past the windows, but in the shifting whiteness, I caught glimpses of something moving, something far too large to be human, its movements too fluid to be natural. The emergency exit handle began to turn slowly on its own, metal groaning against metal. As I backed away, my flashlight beam caught something pressed against the window, a face that existed only in negative space, its features formed by the absence of frost on the glass, and it was smiling. The temperature inside the RV had dropped so low that ice crystals were forming in the air, catching the beam of my flashlight like suspended stars. That's when I first saw it clearly, not as a shadow or a reflection, but as a void in the shape of a person. Standing in my small kitchen area, The space it occupied seemed to absorb light, creating a perfect silhouette of nothingness that hurt my eyes to look at. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where? Outside was a whiteout of swirling snow, and I knew somehow that's exactly what it wanted. The entity moved with a liquid grace that defied physics. Flowing across the ceiling like spilled ink, the metal walls of the RV groaned and buckled inward wherever it passed, as if the very material of reality was trying to escape its touch. I heard its voice again, but this time inside my head. Ancient words that tasted like copper and ash. The creature was speaking through my RV systems now. The radio crackled to life, playing fragments of past broadcasts, but rearranged into words. You came to feed us. Static between each word, getting louder, more insistent. The GPS screen flashed coordinates rapidly, but they were impossible numbers. Locations that couldn't exist on any map. Every electronic device I owned was going haywire, creating a symphony of digital chaos that seemed to energize the entity. I found myself transfixed by its movements, understanding slowly dawning. This wasn't just some mountain spirit or angry ghost. It was something that had existed here long before Mount Rainier rose from the earth. The symbols weren't warnings, they were containment sigils meant to keep it bound to this place. And I, in my ignorance, had driven right through them, breaking a barrier that had stood for millennia. The entity began to take different shapes now, cycling through forms from my memories. The ranger who had warned me, my ex-wife, my dead father. But each form was wrong, like a photo negative left too long in the sun. It was reading my mind, pulling out images to use against me. The walls of the RV began to ripple like water, and I realized with horror that the boundary between our worlds was dissolving. Reality itself was becoming unstable. Through the distortion, I caught glimpses of its true domain, a dimension of perpetual twilight, where the laws of physics were more like suggestions. Shapes moved in that other place, things that made the entity seem tame by comparison. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees, and my breath came out as black smoke. The entity had stopped shifting forms and now stood before me in its true appearance. A tier in reality shaped like a door, waiting for me to step through. And behind that door I heard the voices of everyone who had disappeared on this mountain begging me to join them. The voices grew louder, a chorus of the damned calling from beyond that impossible door. But among them, barely audible, I heard something different. A chant, rhythmic and ancient, repeating in a language that felt older than time. It was coming from my tourist guide, the pages now flipping on their own, glowing with a faint blue light that seemed to repel the darkness around it. The entity recoiled from the book, its void form rippling with what I sensed was fear. My hands shaking, I grabbed the guide and held it up like a shield. The pages settled on an image I hadn't noticed before. A cave painting showing figures holding up symbols against a dark mass. The text described a ritual of binding, used by the native tribes to contain entities that slipped through weak points in our reality. The symbols were the same ones I'd seen on the trees, but now I understood they weren't just warnings. They were a weapon. The entity lashed out, tendrils of pure darkness whipping through the air. One caught my arm, and the cold that spread from that touch went beyond physical. It was draining something from me, something vital. In desperation, I began tracing the symbols in the frost on the windows, copying them from the book. Each completed symbol blazed with that same blue light, and the entity's form became more unstable. Its edges fraying like smoke in a strong wind, but it wasn't enough. The entity had grown too strong. Fed by my fear and the electronic chaos of my RV systems, that's when I remembered the ranger's last words. Everything has a price. The tribes hadn't just used symbols, they had offered something in exchange for the entity's binding. The book mentioned sacrifices, but not of blood or life. They had offered memories, pieces of their own stories. In exchange for the entity's retreat, the temperature dropped even lower as I made my decision, forcing myself to relive my strongest memories. My wedding day, my father's funeral, my first solo camping trip. I spoke them aloud, each one becoming visible as frost patterns in the air, before dissolving into that otherworldly door. The entity's form wavered, drawn to these offerings of pure experience. With each memory offered, the symbols I'd drawn grew brighter, and the tear in reality began to close. But the entity had one last card to play. As the door began to seal, it showed me what would happen if I died here. My body never found. My story becoming another mountain mystery, my consciousness trapped forever in its twilight realm. The vision was so vivid, so terrifying, that I almost forgot the most important symbol, the one that would complete the binding. My fingers were nearly frozen, my mind clouded by the entity's influence. But I had to finish it, because I knew now that I wasn't just fighting for my survival. I was fighting to prevent this thing from growing strong enough to expand its hunting ground beyond the mountain. With trembling fingers, I traced the final symbol, the one the book called the Seal of Binding, using my own frozen breath on the RV's back window. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The blue light from the other symbols converged on this last one, creating a blinding flash that illuminated the entire vehicle. The entity screamed, not in my head this time, but in reality, a sound that shattered every window and electronic screen in the RV. The void door began collapsing in on itself, pulling everything toward it like a black hole. The entity thrashed wildly, its form splitting into countless writhing tendrils that tried to anchor themselves to our reality, but each tendril that touched one of the glowing symbols dissolved into nothingness. My sacrificed memories, visible as swirling mists of frost, formed a barrier between our worlds that grew stronger with each passing second. But I knew it wasn't over. The book had been clear. The binding wouldn't last forever. Someone else would come, just as ignorant as I had been, and break the symbols again. As the entity made its final retreat, it left me with one last vision, countless future travelers, each one potentially breaking the seal, each one becoming a feast for this ancient horror. I knew then what I had to do, even though it meant sacrificing my most precious remaining memory. I offered up my last memory of my father's voice, using it to power a new symbol, one of my own creation, combining the tribe's ancient warnings with modern understanding. As the symbol burned itself into existence, I felt the memory fade away forever, but in exchange, I gained something else. The ability to leave a warning that would resonate with future travelers on a deeper level than any posted sign. The entity vanished with a thunderous implosion, taking the void door with it. The sudden silence was deafening. Snow began drifting in through the shattered windows as I slumped against the wall, physically and mentally drained. Dawn was breaking over Mount Rainier, the first rays of sun illuminating the devastation inside my RV. Every electronic device was fried, the walls were warped and frozen, and my tourist guide had been reduced to ashes. Except for a single page containing the binding symbols, I made it down the mountain somehow, my ruined RV barely holding together. The ranger station was empty when I arrived, but the computer still worked. I logged in as a guest and began typing this warning, knowing that anyone who searches for RV camping spots near Mount Rainier will find it. The entity is bound again, but the seals are weakening. If you're reading this, please stay away from the old service road. The symbols you'll see aren't decoration or vandalism. They're the only things holding back something that sees our world as nothing more than a feast waiting to happen. I don't remember my father's voice anymore or many other things that should be precious to me, but I remember enough to warn you. Some places aren't meant for us. Some roads should remain untraveled. And if you're ever camping on Mount Rainier and see symbols carved into the trees, turn back immediately. Because I sacrificed my memories to bind that thing once, but I can't do it again. Next time, it might be you facing that void door, hearing the voices of the lost, and realizing too late that some sacrifices are permanent. I've been an RV enthusiast for over a decade, traveling across every state, documenting my journeys on my modest travel blog. Death Valley was supposed to be just another destination, another set of beautiful photographs and stories to share. The forecast showed temperatures climbing past 110 degrees that week, but I wasn't concerned. My airstream had never failed me before. The first red flag appeared at the ranger station just outside Furnace Creek. The elderly ranger, weathered like the surrounding rocks, studied my planned route with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Her fingers traced the map, lingering over the remote camping spot I'd selected. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a weight I didn't understand then. "There's been some incidents out there. Maybe stick to the designated campgrounds." When I pressed for details, she just shook her head and mumbled something about things that shouldn't exist. I should have listened. God, why didn't I listen? Instead, I laughed it off and assured her that my solar-powered setup and satellite phone meant I was prepared for anything. Her expression darkened, but she merely stamped my permit and wished me luck. As I walked out, I heard her whispering into her radio, but the words were lost in the hot desert wind. The drive into the park started normally enough. The sun beat down mercilessly on my Airstream's metallic surface as I navigated the winding roads deeper into the park. The GPS signal started fluctuating about an hour in, but I wasn't concerned. It was common in remote areas. What did concern me was the series of dead animals I passed. Not just one or two, but dozens, all positioned facing the same direction, as if they'd been carefully arranged. I told myself it was just the heat that killed them. It was late afternoon when I reached my chosen spot, a secluded area nestled between towering rock formations. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind. My tires crunched over something as I parked, and when I stepped out to check, I found fragments of what looked like old electronic equipment. Bits of cameras, phones, and what might have been another GPS unit lay scattered and sun-bleached, their surfaces etched with strange, spiraling patterns. As I set up camp, the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of blood red. That's when I noticed the petroglyphs on the nearby rock face, crude drawings that seemed to depict people in boxes, vehicles, surrounded by tall, elongated figures below them, newly carved into the ancient rock. Was a single word: run. I convinced myself it was just graffiti from some teenager trying to scare tourists. Looking back now, I realize it was the last warning I would get before everything went terribly, horribly wrong. The first thing that died was my phone. One moment I was trying to take photos of the sunset, and the next, the screen flickered with strange symbols before going completely dark. Not just powered off, the screen was pitch black, as if the pixels themselves had been drained of life. When I tried to power it back on, the device grew so hot I had to drop it. It left an odd spiral-shaped burn mark on my palm. My Airstream system started failing one by one as darkness fell. First, the AC sputtered and died, leaving me at the mercy of the desert heat. Then the LED lights began to flicker in a rhythmic pattern that almost seemed like Morse code. I tried to decode it, but the message made no sense. Just repeating sequences of numbers that made my head hurt when I looked at them too long. The worst part was the sounds. As the night grew deeper, I started hearing what sounded like fingernails dragging across the Airstream's aluminum skin. The scratching moved in patterns, circling the hive with mechanical precision. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside with my flashlight, there were no marks on the surface, but the metal felt ice cold to the touch. Impossible in the desert heat. My satellite radio picked up nothing but static, except for brief moments when voices would cut through. They spoke in what sounded like English played backwards, and underneath it all was a deep, rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth ache. I tried to record it on my backup phone, but that device died too, the screen displaying the same strange symbols before going dark. Around midnight, I noticed lights in the distance. Not the warm glow of campfires or flashlights, but cold blue-white orbs that moved with deliberate purpose across the desert floor. They seemed to be performing some kind of search pattern, methodically covering the area. Every time they came closer to my campsite, my Arv's metal frame would vibrate with a low frequency that made me nauseous. I tried to start the engine, thinking I could drive back to the ranger station, but the electronic ignition was dead. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of something tall and angular moving between the rock formations, its movements too precise to be human. When I turned to look directly, it was gone, but I could feel something watching me, studying me, like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. That's when I realized I wasn't a visitor in Death Valley anymore. I was a prisoner. I've spent hours debating whether to describe what happened next. My therapist says I should write it all down, but some things weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. The events of that night changed my understanding of reality forever, and not in a good way. The scratching sounds had stopped, replaced by something worse, a low mechanical hum that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The rock formations around my campsite began to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow, revealing symbols similar to the ones that had appeared on my phones. That's when I realized they weren't random patterns, they were blueprints of some kind. Designs for machines that defied our laws of physics. Through my ARV's window, I watched in horror as the ground began to shift. What I had assumed were natural rock formations started to move, revealing gleaming metal surfaces underneath their desert-worn facades. The entire valley was artificial, a massive machine disguised as nature. Dormant until now, the strange deaths, the technological failures, the disappearances, it all made terrible sense. I made my first escape attempt around 3 a.m. The beings, I refuse to call them aliens because I don't think that term does justice to what they truly are, were distracted by some kind of maintenance ritual around one of the larger formations. I grabbed my emergency pack and slipped out the RV's side door, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible across the desert floor. I made it about half a mile before the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. The sand shifted, revealing segmented metal panels that rose up like scales on a massive serpent. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't walking on natural ground at all. The entire desert floor was a giant mechanism. Through the gaps in the rising panels, I caught glimpses of massive gears and pulsing energy conduits that stretched into infinite darkness below. They herded me back to my RAV using fields of force I could feel, but not see. The tall, angular figures I'd glimpsed earlier now moved openly, their bodies seeming to shift between solid and geometric wireframe forms. One of them approached my RAV and pressed its hand against the metal. The entire vehicle shuddered and every piece of electronics inside came back to life simultaneously. But wrong. The screens all displayed the same message now. Observation continues. Remain in containment. I understood then that my RV wasn't just broken. It had been converted into part of their system, an observation tank for their human specimen, me. And as I huddled inside, watching more of their kind emerge from the false rocks around me, I realized the truth. Death Valley wasn't just their outpost, it was their laboratory, and I had just become their newest experiment. The conversion of my RV was only the beginning. As the desert night wore on, I watched through the windows as my temporary prison was systematically modified by these entities. Every piece of metal in my vehicle was being repurposed, transformed into something that straddled the line between technology and organic matter. The walls pulsed with an internal light that seemed to follow my movements, and I could feel the entire structure studying me. They began their tests shortly before dawn. The air inside the RV became thick with floating symbols, not projected, but somehow existing in three-dimensional space. They moved like schools of fish, forming complex patterns that made my mind ache when I tried to comprehend them. I realized they were attempting to communicate, but their language was mathematical, conceptual, ideas that the human brain wasn't meant to process. The worst part was when they started showing me the others. Through the shifting walls of my prison, I saw ghostly recordings of previous specimens, other travelers who had wandered into their testing ground. Each recording showed a different experiment, a different way of studying human response to their reality. Some of the victims had lasted days, others mere hours before their minds broke under the strain of understanding what they were seeing. Then they showed me their true purpose. The shifting patterns coalesced into a vast three-dimensional model of Earth's timeline. I saw how they had been here long before us, their facilities disguised as natural formations across the planet. Death Valley was just one of many observation posts, but it was special. A place where the barrier between their reality and ours was thin enough for direct interaction. They weren't just studying us. They were preparing us, preparing humanity for something coming. something so vast and incomprehensible that they considered our current form woefully inadequate. In my terror, I discovered something they hadn't anticipated: human irrationality, when one of them reached through the wall of the RV, its form shifting between solid and wireframe. I didn't respond with the logical fear and submission they expected. Instead, I grabbed the closest thing at hand, my cast iron skillet, and swung it through their shifting form. The entity recoiled, its geometric patterns disrupted, emitting a sound that made my nose bleed. The entire structure of my prison shuddered. The other entities outside froze in what I can only describe as surprise. In that moment, I realized their biggest weakness. They couldn't comprehend human chaos, the illogical choices we make in moments of pure panic. They were beings of pure logic and pattern, and my random act of violence had momentarily disrupted their carefully constructed experiment. But my small victory came with a price. As the entities recovered from their surprise, the walls of my RV began to dissolve completely, transforming into something else entirely. They were done with subtle observation. Now, they wanted to see exactly how far they could push a human mind before it shattered. As my reality began to warp around me, I knew I had only one chance left, and it would require embracing complete, absolute madness to escape. They say that insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. But what saved me was doing everything differently, embracing complete chaos in a way their logical minds couldn't predict. I started singing children's songs backwards, reciting random numbers, drawing irregular patterns in the air, anything to create pure, human disorder in their perfectly structured world. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The geometric patterns around me began to stutter and glitch, like a computer program encountering invalid data. The beings moved erratically, their wireframe forms distorting as they tried to process my irrational behavior. The walls of what used to be my RV rippled and warped, their carefully constructed observation chamber struggling to maintain coherence in the face of pure human chaos. In that moment of confusion, I saw my chance. The desert floor was still partially open, revealing the massive machinery beneath. Instead of running away from it like they expected, I dove straight into the gap. As I fell past massive gears and pulsing energy conduits, I grabbed onto the cables and mechanical parts, swinging from one to another like some desperate urban explorer. My actions made no logical sense, which is exactly why they worked. The entire facility began to malfunction. Alarms blared in impossible frequencies as the beings tried to recalibrate their systems. The false rock formations started crumbling, revealing more of their true nature. In their panic to contain the cascade of system failures, they lost track of me. I kept moving deeper into their machinery, guided only by blind instinct and the desperate need to escape. I found what looked like a maintenance tunnel, too regular to be natural, too organic to be human-made. Above me, I could hear their world falling apart as my chaotic influence spread through their systems like a virus. The tunnel led upward, and after what felt like hours of climbing, I emerged in a different part of Death Valley, miles from where I'd started. Behind me, the ground shook as their facility went into some kind of emergency lockdown. That was 3 months ago. My airstream, my phones, my cameras, all of it is still there, probably completely transformed by now into something beyond human understanding. I've tried reporting what happened to the authorities, but how do you explain that one of America's most famous national parks is actually a testing facility run by interdimensional beings? They either think I'm crazy, or they already know and are part of it. So I'm writing this warning instead. If you're planning an RV trip to Death Valley, don't. If you see strange symbols appearing on your devices, run. If you hear about remote camping spots with unusual phenomena, stay away. They're still out there, still watching, still experimenting. But now they know that humans can fight back in ways they never expected. Through pure, wonderful irrationality, I keep tracking news reports about Death Valley. There's been a marked increase in temporary closures of certain areas for geological surveys, more missing persons reports, more strange lights in the sky. They're adapting, learning from my escape. Next time, they won't underestimate human chaos. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. Some parts of this world aren't what they seem, and some camping spots should remain empty if you value your sanity, your reality, your very humanity. Stay away from Death Valley, because they're waiting, watching, and they're getting better at their experiments. End of report. GPS coordinates redacted. Date redacted. Original equipment. I should have listened to the old man at the gas station. His weathered face and trembling hands should have been warning enough. But I was too proud, too stubborn to heed his desperate plea. Devil's Peak ain't a place for camping, he had said, his rheumy eyes fixed on some distant point beyond my shoulder. Especially not in winter, them woods. They take folks. Been that way since before my granddaddy's time. The Winnebago hummed steadily as I navigated the winding forest road. Heavy snow beginning to dust the windshield. The rental agent had assured me this 2023 model could handle any weather, but something about the deepening shadows between the ancient pines made me doubt that claim. My phone's GPS had lost signal an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but a paper map and fading daylight to guide me to the camping grounds. The first sign I saw was so snow-covered I almost missed it. Devil's Peak Forest. No overnight camping between October and March. The metal was bent and rusted, as if something had tried to tear it from the ground. I convinced myself it was just an old regulation, probably outdated. The Forest Service website had shown the grounds as open year-round, and I'd already driven 5 hours to get here. The camping area was deserted when I arrived, which should have been my second warning. Even in winter, these grounds usually had at least a few hardy souls braving the cold. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath my tires and the occasional groan of branches heavy with ice. As I parked in what seemed like a decent spot, I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the clearing. They all seemed to lean away from something, their ancient trunks twisted at unnatural angles. The thick bark was marked with deep gouges, too high and too wide to be from any bear I knew of. As I stepped out of the RV to investigate, the frigid air hit my lungs like needles, and an overwhelming sense of being watched crashed over me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only endless rows of snow-laden pines stretching into darkness. That first night, I told myself the sounds were just the wind. The scratching at my door was merely branches in the storm. The shadows that seemed to move against the moonlight were tricks of my tired mind. But when I woke to find strange symbols carved into the frost on my windows from the inside, I knew I had made a terrible mistake, and it was far too late to leave. The snow had already blocked the only road out. The RV died at exactly 3:33 a.m. I remember checking my watch by flashlight, its beam barely penetrating the absolute darkness that had settled over Devil's Peak. The heater sputtered out first, followed by every electrical system in rapid succession. Even the emergency battery pack I'd brought as a backup was dead, though I'd charged it fully before leaving. Through the thickly frosted windows, I could make out strange lights dancing between the trees, too steady to be fireflies, too erratic to be flashlights. They moved with purpose, weaving patterns that made my eyes hurt and my head spin. I tried starting the engine again, but the starter wouldn't even click. The temperature inside the RV was dropping rapidly, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. That's when I first heard the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible over the howling wind, speaking in a language that sounded ancient and wrong. The words seemed to slither through the cracks in the RV's walls, carrying with them the musty smell of decay and wet earth. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. The scratching started next. Not the gentle brush of branches I'd heard the night before, but deliberate, methodical marks being carved into the RV's metal skin. I could hear whatever was out there moving around the vehicle, its weight making the snow crunch in a rhythm that was distinctly bipedal, yet somehow wrong. The footsteps would approach, pause, and then circle again, each time getting slightly closer. My phone was useless, showing only an error message I'd never seen before. Strange symbols that resembled the markings I'd found on my windows. The satellite radio picked up nothing but static. Occasionally broken by what sounded like children laughing, the laughter grew more distorted with each passing minute until it became indistinguishable from screams. As dawn approached, I found deep gouges in the RV's walls, perfect geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. The metal around them was ice cold to the touch, and placing my hand near them filled my mind with visions of things that lurked in the spaces between trees, waiting in the darkness since before humans walked the earth. I knew then that I needed to run, but when I looked outside, the road had completely disappeared beneath the snow. Dawn never came. The darkness stretched on well past when the sun should have risen, broken only by those sickly lights that continued their hypnotic dance through the trees. My watch had stopped at 3:33 a.m., and no matter how many times I checked my phone, it showed the same time. Those strange symbols growing more complex with each glance. The thing that finally forced me out of the RV wasn't the cold or the fear. It was the smell. It started seeping through the vents, a putrid mixture of wet soil, rotting leaves, and something metallic that reminded me of old blood. When black liquid began dripping from the ceiling, forming those same geometric patterns I'd seen carved outside, I knew I had to leave, even if it meant facing whatever waited in the forest. I wasn't prepared for what I found outside. The snow had turned black where it touched the ground, and the trees had changed. Their bark was covered in pulsing veins that glowed with the same sickly light I'd seen between them. What was worse, they had moved. I know how that sounds, but I swear every tree had shifted position since I'd parked, forming a perfect circle around my RV. That's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the darkness between the trees. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs too long and bent at angles that made my mind recoil. They moved with a jerking, insect-like motion, but their footprints in the snow were eerily human. As I watched, frozen in terror, one of them turned its head toward me, where a face should have been. There was only a swirling void filled with those same geometric patterns. The symbols from my windows were everywhere now, carved into every surface, glowing with an inner light that hurt my eyes. They seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new patterns that felt like they were trying to tell me something ancient, something horrible. The whispers had returned, but now I was beginning to understand their words, and I wished desperately that I couldn't. A scream echoed through the forest, my own. Though I didn't remember making it, the entities moved closer, their void faces rippling with dark amusement. As they approached, the trees began to twist and bend, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. I ran back to the eave, but the door had vanished, replaced by a smooth wall covered in those pulsing symbols. I was trapped outside, and they were coming closer. The entities surrounded me in a perfect circle, their void faces rippling with ancient symbols that matched those covering every surface of the forest. The temperature had dropped so low that each breath crystallized instantly, forming geometric patterns in the air that mirrored the marks on the trees. Through their impossible forms, I could see more of them moving in the distance, emerging from spaces that shouldn't exist. That's when the memories hit me. Not my own, but older ones belonging to others who had come here before. I saw the native tribes who had marked this place as forbidden ground, the settlers who disappeared without trace, and countless others drawn here across centuries. Each memory carried the same terrible revelation. This wasn't a forest at all, but something else wearing the shape of one, a trap that had existed since before time had meaning. The symbols began to move on their own, peeling themselves from the surfaces they were carved into and floating in the air around me. Each one carried a fragment of knowledge that burned itself into my mind. I learned of the entities, the Watchers, as they had once been called, and their purpose. They were collectors, gatherers of experiences and memories, keeping their victims in a state between life and death for centuries. My RV had completely transformed now, its metal skin replaced by writhing organic matter covered in pulsing veins. The door reappeared, but it opened into a void filled with floating geometric shapes and fragments of other people's memories. Inside, I could see others, dozens of them, suspended in time. their faces frozen in eternal screams. Some I recognized from missing persons reports I'd researched before my trip. The watchers moved closer, their limbs elongating impossibly as they reached for me. The whispers had become a chorus now, speaking in unified voices that resonated through my bones. They spoke of ancient pacts, of sacrifices made to keep something even worse bound beneath the forest floor. The trees themselves began to crack open, revealing pulsing organs and twisted faces pressed against the wood from the inside. In that moment of pure terror, I understood the truth. Devil's Peak wasn't named for its shape, but for what it contained. The forest was a prison, the watchers its guards, and every missing person had been payment to keep the prisoner sleeping. As this knowledge filled my mind, I felt something vast and ancient stirring deep below the ground. Disturbed by my presence, the watchers' movements became more urgent, more desperate. They weren't trying to catch me. They were trying to stop what I had accidentally set in motion. The ground began to crack beneath my feet, dark liquid seeping through fissures that formed perfect geometric patterns. The watchers' movements became frantic as tremors shook the forest, their void faces turned downward, and for the first time, I sensed fear in their otherworldly movements. Something massive was awakening below, something they had spent eons containing. I ran, not toward the road. It no longer existed in any meaningful way, but toward the gaps between the watchers' shifting forms. Their limbs stretched to catch me, but they were divided between reaching for me and pressing their hands to the ground, trying to contain whatever stirred beneath. The whispers had become screams, a cacophony of voices begging in languages dead for millennia. The memories of past victims flashed through my mind, showing me a path that shouldn't exist. I saw myself through dozens of different eyes, running through impossible spaces between the trees. The forest twisted around me, reality bending as the prisoner below fought against its ancient bonds. Trees burst from the ground, their roots dripping with that black liquid, trying to block my path. The geometric symbols floating in the air began to shatter, each breaking apart with a sound like screaming glass. As they broke, I felt the memories they contained flooding into my mind. Hundreds of years of trapped consciousness, all trying to escape at once. The watchers were losing control, their careful collection of experiences and memories unraveling as their prisoner's influence grew stronger. My escape was pure instinct, guided by the fractured memories of all who had died here. I found myself running through spaces that didn't follow normal geometry, passing through moments from different times, seeing the forest as it had existed across centuries. The black liquid had become a flood, dissolving everything it touched into more symbols that quickly shattered. Through it all, I could feel something massive rising, using the chaos of my escape as its opportunity. I remember breaking through the last barrier, emerging onto a snow-covered road as reality snapped back into place behind me. My watch started ticking again, showing 3 days had passed. The forest behind me looked normal now, but I could see the symbols still moving beneath its surface, like words written on the underside of reality. I've spent every day since trying to forget what I learned in those woods, but the memories of hundreds of other victims still float through my dreams. Sometimes I wake to find geometric patterns drawn in frost on my bedroom windows, and I know they're still watching, still waiting, and whatever they were keeping prisoner, I fear it won't stay contained much longer. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS stopped working. Sarah and I had been driving our newly rented Jayco Redhawk for 6 hours, and the last gas station attendant's warning still echoed in my mind. "Devil's Canyon ain't no place for camping," he'd said, his weathered face grimacing. "Folks go missing there." The summer heat was brutal, even with the AC running full blast. As we navigated the winding roads, the towering red cliffs of Devil's Canyon cast long shadows across our path. Sarah squeezed my hand, her excitement evident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had been building since we left the main highway. Our fancy new RV, a 2022 Jayco Redhawk, represented everything we'd saved for. Our dream of breaking free from city life, even if just for a week. The brochure had made Devil's Canyon sound perfect. secluded, pristine, and far from the tourist traps. Now, as the sun began to set, that seclusion felt less like a selling point and more like a warning. We found the campsite just before dusk, a flat area overlooking the canyon. The moment I cut the engine, the silence hit us. No birds, no insects, nothing but the cooling tick of the engine and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Sarah started setting up our outdoor area while I checked the RV's systems. Everything worked perfectly, almost too perfectly. That's when we noticed the first strange thing. While unfolding the camping chairs, Sarah found a tattered journal wedged between some rocks. Its pages were filled with frantic scribblings about shadows that moved against the wind and voices that called from the canyon depths. We laughed it off as someone's creative writing project, but my laughter felt hollow. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically and the wind picked up. We huddled inside the RV, planning our hikes for the next day. Neither of us mentioned the strange scratching sounds coming from the roof, or the fact that our phones now showed no signal at all. We were alone in Devil's Canyon, and for the first time, I wondered if the gas station attendant had been trying to do more than just scare a couple of city tourists. The problem started at midnight. First, the RV's electrical system began flickering without explanation. The lights pulsed in an irregular rhythm, and the digital displays on our appliances showed random sequences of numbers. Sarah insisted it was just a battery issue, but I'd checked everything twice before our trip, when the temperature inside dropped to near freezing despite the summer heat outside. We knew something was seriously wrong. The heater wouldn't respond and our breath came out in visible puffs. Sarah wrapped herself in blankets while I tried rebooting the RV's systems. Nothing worked. The modern convenience of our Jayco Red Hawk had transformed into a technological nightmare. The radio turned itself on, cycling through frequencies, catching nothing but static and occasional fragments of what sounded like voices speaking backwards. We tried starting the engine to charge the battery, but it just clicked uselessly. The realization hit hard. We were stuck here in the darkness, miles from the nearest town. That's when we heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping from beneath the RV. At first we thought it was the wind, but the sound had a purpose to it, like something was testing our defenses. Sarah suggested we try walking out for help, but one look through the windows changed our minds. The moonlight revealed dozens of strange tracks in the dust around our vehicle. The scratching sounds from earlier returned, now moving systematically around the RV's exterior. We huddled in the bedroom, listening as whatever was outside seemed to be searching for a way in. Our phones were dead now, not just without signal, completely drained of power despite being fully charged hours ago. As the night wore on, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The distinct sound of the journal's pages turning from where we'd left it on the dining table. When we gathered the courage to look, we found new writing had appeared, a single line in fresh ink. They only hunt at night. The shadows came alive at 3 a.m. They moved against the moonlight, forming impossible shapes that slithered across our windows. The journal on the table continued filling itself with warnings, each message more desperate than the last. "They're ancient, they're hungry, they remember!" Sarah screamed when the first one touched the RV. It wasn't a physical touch. It was like the metal itself shuddered in revulsion. Through the windshield, we watched as dark forms rose from the canyon depths, their bodies twisting in ways that hurt to look at. They brought with them the smell of deep earth and decay. Our Jayco's metal frame began to groan under some impossible pressure. The walls curved inward, defying physics, as if something was trying to compress our sanctuary into a metal coffin. In our panic to retreat to the bedroom, we discovered why all those other people had vanished. The floor beneath our feet had become unnaturally soft, like quicksand. The entities began speaking, not in words, but in memories of every terrible sound we'd ever heard. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened as we watched handprints appear in the ceiling, pressing downward. They weren't human hands. The prints had too many fingers, and they left smoking impressions in the metal. I made a desperate break for the driver's seat, thinking we could somehow crash our way out. That's when we saw them clearly for the first time. Through the windshield, illuminated by our dying interior lights, ancient things, wearing faces they'd borrowed from their previous victims, stretched across impossibly long, shadow-wrapped bodies. The journal's pages flipped madly now, revealing its final message: run. The RV can't protect you anymore. Run or join us in the deep. As if responding to these words, every window in our vehicle cracked simultaneously, forming spiderweb patterns that seemed to spell out words in a language older than time. The windows exploded inwards simultaneously. Sarah and I hit the floor as shadows poured into our RAV like liquid darkness. The borrowed faces of previous victims watched us from every angle, their features twisted in eternal screams. We had seconds to act before they reached us. I remembered the emergency flares in the cabinet while Sarah barricaded herself in the bathroom. I lunged for them, my hands shaking as I ripped open the package. The creatures recoiled from the sudden burst of red light, their shadowy forms wavering like smoke in a wind. The flare's light revealed horrifying truths. The walls of our RV had become transparent, showing the canyon's true nature. Beneath the red rocks lay a vast pulsing network of organic matter, like veins in living tissue. Our campsite wasn't just on the canyon. It was on something ancient and aware. Sarah screamed my name as the bathroom door began to melt. I tossed her a flare through the dissolving metal. The entities circled us, their movements becoming more frenzied as our light sources slowly dimmed. In their anger, they revealed flashes of their true forms, crystalline structures that predated life itself. The RV's floor finally gave way, revealing a pit that descended into absolute darkness. Ancient symbols carved into rock spiraled downward, glowing with a sickly phosphorescence. The journal's pages swirled around us, each sheet showing maps of the canyon's tunnels and the thousands of RVs and vehicles that had been dragged down before us. Our flares were dying, and with them our last defense. Through the disintegrating roof, we watched as more entities rose from the canyon depths, their bodies blocking out the stars themselves. They spoke again, this time in clear, terrible voices. "Join our collection. Your faces will serve us well." As our last flare died, I remembered the propane tanks. In a desperate move, I threw the tank down the growing pit and shot it with the emergency flare gun. The explosion shook the canyon, momentarily dispersing the entities and illuminating an escape path through their ranks. Sarah and I ran through the burning wreckage of our RV, the heat keeping the shadow creatures at bay. Behind us, our Jayco Redhawks sank into the canyon floor, becoming another trophy in their ancient collection. The entities howled with voices stolen from 1,000 victims. Dawn was breaking as we sprinted across the canyon rim. The rising sun seemed to weaken them, their borrowed faces melting away to reveal glimpses of their true forms, geometric nightmares that shouldn't exist in our reality. The ground cracked beneath our feet, trying to drag us back. We reached our phone's signal range just as the sun cleared the horizon. The entities retreated, leaving behind only the journal, now filled with our own story, written in our handwriting. Though we'd never touched it, the final pages contained coordinates of every victim they'd claimed over centuries. I'm writing this now from a hospital room, where doctors can't explain our severe radiation burns or why our hair turned white. The authorities who investigated found only a massive sinkhole where our campsite had been. They couldn't explain the thousands of personal belongings scattered in the depths. Dating back to the 1800s, consider this a final warning. Devil's Canyon isn't on most maps anymore, and now I know why. If you're reading this and thinking about taking your RV there, don't. Those things are still waiting, wearing the faces of everyone they've taken, and after what we saw, I know they're spreading. Testing other canyons, other lonely places. They're patient, they're hungry, and they remember every face they collect. Looking back, I should have known something was wrong from the moment we entered Redwood National Park. The fog that day wasn't like the usual marine layer that rolls in from the Pacific. It moved against the wind, curling around our RAV like curious fingers testing the metal shell. My wife Sarah kept telling me to focus on the road, but I couldn't help taking quick shots with my camera whenever we passed particularly massive redwoods. Our son, Jake, had finally put down his phone. pressing his face against the window in genuine awe. These ancient giants had a way of commanding attention, their massive trunks disappearing into the mist high above us. The camp host at the RV site seemed oddly hesitant when we checked in. "Lot 23 is available," he said, his weathered face twitching slightly. "It's a bit secluded. Most folks prefer to stay closer to the main area this time of year." When I asked why, he just shrugged and muttered something about the fog making it hard to find your way back after dark. Setting up our Thor motor coach was straightforward enough, though the leveling system kept giving us strange readings. As if the ground beneath us was subtly shifting, Jake was the first to notice the unusual silence. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just the occasional sound of water droplets hitting our roof with oddly precise timing. Like a metronome counting down to something, I spent the afternoon photographing the surrounding trees, fascinated by how the fog created natural frames around their massive trunks. It wasn't until I reviewed the images on my camera's display that evening that I noticed something unsettling in several shots. The fog seemed to form distinct shapes, too distinct to be random in one particular photo. I could swear I saw a face pressed against one of the tree trunks, its features twisted in an expression of silent warning. That first night, we were awakened by a sound like gentle tapping on our RV's walls. Sarah thought it was just branches in the wind, but there was no wind. Jake said it reminded him of sap flowing through wood, but amplified, as if our metal home was trying to mimic the living forest around us. When I checked the walls with my flashlight, I found the first small patch of something that looked disturbingly like tree rings forming on our ceiling. Though in the morning light, I managed to convince myself it was just condensation marks. The morning brought no relief from the fog. If anything, it seemed thicker, pressing against our RV's windows like a living blanket. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came during breakfast, when Sarah noticed the kitchen counter felt different. Running her hand across the surface, she discovered it had developed the texture of bark, rough and organic beneath her fingers. I tried convincing myself it was just condensation damage, but deep down I knew better. The green, viscous liquid I found seeping from our bathroom cabinet wasn't water damage. It pulsed with a faint bioluminescence and smelled like fresh pine sap. When I tried to wipe it away, it seemed to retreat into the metal like it was being absorbed back into living tissue. Jake's room in the back of the RV had it worst. The walls there had developed distinct patterns overnight, circular rings that seemed to grow outward like time-lapse footage of tree growth. When he pressed his ear against them, he said he could hear something like a heartbeat, but slower, deeper, more like the ancient rhythm of seasonal growth. We tried to start the RV, planning to leave before things got worse. The engine turned over, but the entire vehicle shuddered unnaturally, and through the windshield, I could swear I saw the trees move closer together, their massive trunks somehow shifting position when viewed through the increasingly dense fog. The GP started showing impossible readings, the screen filling with spiral patterns that looked disturbingly like growth rings. Sarah discovered her phone's camera was capturing something our eyes couldn't quite see. In her photos, the fog outside wasn't just fog anymore. It had structure, like millions of microscopic threads connecting our RV to the surrounding trees. Each new picture showed these connections growing thicker, more defined, as if we were being slowly integrated into the forest's vast network. That afternoon, we heard the first whispers. They came through the walls, carried by the green liquid that now seeped from every joint and seam in our vehicle. The voices were like rustling leaves, speaking in fragments of ancient memories, of centuries of growth, of roots intertwined deep beneath the earth, of a hunger to connect, to expand, to assimilate. Jake was the first to understand what they were saying. The forest was lonely, and it had chosen us to join its ancient community. The transformation of our RV accelerated as the third day dawned. The metal walls now pulsed with visible veins of green bioluminescence, and patches of bark-like growth had spread across every surface. When I tried to open the main door, the frame had warped and fused like living wood, sealing us inside our evolving prison. We discovered the truth about our situation in the most horrifying way possible, while searching through our storage compartments for anything that might help us escape. Sarah found an old journal wedged behind a panel that had partially transformed into wood. Its pages, stained with the same green fluid that now ran through our walls, contained the frantic writings of another traveler. According to the entries, we weren't the first to be chosen by the forest. The journal described other RVs, other families, all trapped over the years. The forest, it seemed, had developed a taste for modern vessels, converting them into hybrid growths, part machine, part tree, with their occupants serving as nutrients for the transformation. The final pages were almost illegible, the handwriting deteriorating into patterns that looked unsettlingly like tree rings. Jake's condition worried us the most. The spots on his arms that had brushed against the walls were starting to show the same ringed patterns we'd seen spreading across our Arv. He said he could feel the forest's thoughts now, its ancient consciousness seeping into his mind. The whispers had become a constant chorus, promising eternal peace as part of something greater than ourselves. Through the windows, now clouded with a web-like pattern of green veins, we could see other vehicles partially absorbed into the landscape. Their shapes were barely recognizable, transformed into bizarre hybrids of metal and organic matter. Most disturbing were the humanoid shapes we could make out through their clouded windows, forms that seemed to be caught in mid-transformation, neither fully human nor fully tree. Sarah found our last hope in the journal, a hastily scrawled note about the fog being thinnest just before dawn, when the forest's collective consciousness briefly dims. But as we formulated an escape plan, the walls of our RV began to constrict with audible groans, and the green fluid started rising from the floor like sap in springtime. The forest had sensed our resistance, and it wasn't going to let its chosen ones escape easily. Dawn was still hours away, but we couldn't wait any longer. Jake's transformation was accelerating. The rings on his arms had spread past his elbows, and tiny luminescent sprouts were emerging from his skin. Sarah's hands had begun to stiffen, her fingers elongating like young branches reaching for sunlight. My own vision had started to fragment, each eye now seeing through what felt like hundreds of tiny lenses. Like looking through a kaleidoscope made of leaves, we decided to use the emergency hatch in the RV's roof, our last potential escape route. The main door had completely sealed itself, the metal and wood fusion creating an impenetrable barrier. As I helped Jake toward the hatch, we could hear the forest's whispers growing into angry howls, a sound like wind through ancient hollow trunks, but with purpose and malice. The moment we started to open the hatch, the RRV's interior erupted into chaos. The green fluid began spraying from every surface, carrying with it spores that filled the air with bioluminescent clouds. The walls rippled and buckled, trying to grab us with newly formed tendrils of wood and metal. Sarah screamed as one wrapped around her ankle, its surface quickly trying to fuse with her increasingly bark-like skin. Through the hatch, we could see other RRVs in the fog. Their positions changed since yesterday. They had moved closer, forming a tight circle around us. Their surfaces writhed with partially absorbed victims, reaching out with branch-like limbs. Their faces now more knot and burl than human features. Their movements were synchronized, like leaves dancing in a single breeze, all controlled by the forest's hive mind. I managed to get Jake onto the roof, but the Arv's surface was no longer solid metal. It had become a living, moving thing. The green fluid seemed to follow our movements, trying to trap us in rapidly growing wooden structures that burst from the vehicle's skin. Sarah was pulling herself up when a massive tendril, thick as a young redwood, erupted from the forest floor and wrapped around our entire vehicle. The fog itself seemed to solidify, becoming a web of visible connections between the ancient trees and our Arv. Through my increasingly inhuman vision, I could see the network of bioluminescent strands stretching through the entire forest, connecting everything in a vast, living network. And at that moment, I understood what the forest truly wanted. Not just to absorb us, but to add our consciousness to its ancient memory, to make us part of its eternal story. The pre-dawn darkness seemed to pulse with bioluminescent fury as we fought our way across the RV's mutated roof. The fog had become almost solid, each step feeling like we were wading through living tissue that tried to merge with our increasingly transforming bodies. Jake's right arm had completely turned to wood, and Sarah's bark-like skin now covered most of her torso. The forest's rage manifested in waves of intense pressure, the ancient trees creaking and swaying inward, their massive trunks threatening to crush us, and our vehicle turned cocoon. The other absorbed RVs began emitting a haunting chorus of creaks and groans, their partly transformed occupants reaching for us with branch-like limbs, begging us to join them in their eternal communion with the forest. Our salvation came from an unexpected source: fire. When a tendril wrapped around my leg, I desperately used my camera's flash, and the sudden burst of light made it recoil. The forest, for all its ancient power, still harbored a primitive fear of flame. Sarah remembered the emergency flares in her hiking pack, still trapped inside our hive. In a moment of desperate clarity, we realized our only chance was to go back inside. The return through the hatch was like diving into a living nightmare. The RV's interior had become a pulsing chamber of organic horror, every surface alive and hungry. While Jake and I distracted the writhing tendrils with my camera's repeated flashes, Sarah fought her way to her pack. The green fluid tried to rise up and drown us, but our partially transformed bodies gave us a strange advantage. We could feel the forest's intentions seconds before it acted. When Sarah finally ignited the flares, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The forest's consciousness recoiled from the harsh artificial light and heat. The fog retreated like a living thing burned, creating a pathway between the trees. The tendrils holding our hive loosened their grip, and the vehicle's transformation temporarily reversed. Metal surfaces briefly visible beneath the organic growth. We ran. Our bodies were partially transformed, but our minds remained our own. Behind us, we could hear the forest's psychic scream of frustration, felt the pull of its collective consciousness trying to draw us back. The other victims reached for us with their wooden limbs, their faces now just whorls in living wood, silently pleading or warning. We couldn't tell which. Dawn broke as we reached the park's main road, and with it came an odd sense of release. The transformation stopped progressing, leaving us caught between human and tree. We can never fully return to who we were. My skin still shows patterns like wood grain. Jake's right arm remains more branch than flesh, and Sarah's hair has become like fine, forever growing twigs. But we're alive, and still ourselves. I'm writing this warning because the forest is patient, and it's learning. Each failure teaches it new ways to lure and trap visitors. The park rangers don't believe our story, but they can't explain the missing RVs or the strange shadows in the fog. To anyone reading this, if you go camping in Redwood National Park and the fog starts moving against the wind, run. Run before the forest decides to make you part of its ever-growing family. The first signs the roads leading into Black Hills were exactly what I expected. Winding paths cutting through dense forests and rocky outcrops. What I didn't expect was how quickly my camera batteries would drain. I'd been documenting my RV trips for years, but something felt different about this one from the moment I passed the "Welcome to South Dakota" sign. I'd chosen this location after reading about the abandoned mines scattered throughout the region. My photography blog needed something fresh, something that would stand out from the endless stream of national park photos flooding social media. The story of the mines, with their century-old history and local legends, seemed perfect. If only I'd paid more attention to those legends before setting up camp. The first sign that something was wrong came when I was reviewing the day's photos at my campsite. Most were normal, landscapes, wildlife, the usual stuff. But there was one shot of an old mine entrance that made my skin crawl. In the bottom right corner, barely visible against the darkness of the mine shaft, was what looked like a hand, not a human hand. The fingers were too long, too thin, almost like strands of black smoke forming a grotesque parody of human anatomy. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of light and shadow. But when I attempted to delete the photo, my camera shut down completely. Brand new batteries, dead in seconds. I switched to my backup camera, but the same thing happened when I tried to photograph the same spot. By sunset, I'd gone through 6 sets of batteries and my RV's electrical system had started acting up, lights flickering, radio turning on and off by itself. That night, huddled in my ARV, I discovered something even more disturbing. The photos on my laptop were changing, not all of them, just the ones taken near the mines. With each viewing, the shadowy figures in the background became more distinct, more numerous in one particularly unsettling image. What had initially been an empty forest path now showed a line of dark silhouettes, all facing my direction, their forms seeming to elongate and reach toward the camera. I should have left right then, should have started the engine and driven straight out of Black Hills, but I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation, some kind of electromagnetic interference from the old mining equipment. Perhaps, besides, I'd invested too much in this trip to leave without getting the story I came for. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my laptop screen flickered one last time, displaying a photo I didn't remember taking. My ARV from the outside, surrounded by dozens of those elongated shadows, all reaching toward my window. Little did I know, they weren't just reaching for my window anymore. They were already inside, drawn to every piece of electronic equipment I'd brought with me, and they were hungry. I woke up to the sound of static, not just from one device, but from every electronic item in my RAV. My phone, laptop, cameras, even my digital watch. The noise formed a discordant symphony that made my teeth ache. When I tried to turn them off, nothing responded. Each screen displayed the same thing, random pixels forming what looked like faces in the static. The morning light revealed something I'd missed in the darkness. All my charging cables had black marks along their length like burn tracks, but they moved when I watched them closely, shifting and writhing like living ink. I unplugged everything, but the marks remained, slowly spreading across the surfaces they touched. My expensive camera equipment was covered in these marks now, and through the viewfinder, everything appeared distorted, as if being viewed through dark water. I found an old Polaroid camera in my equipment bag, something I'd brought along as a backup, more out of nostalgia than necessity. The instant photos it produced showed what my digital cameras couldn't. The truth, in each Polaroid shot, the black marks were clearly visible as serpentine shapes coiling around my equipment like parasitic vines. But most disturbing was what I caught in the background. Tall, impossibly thin figures standing just at the edge of the frame, their forms seeming to bend and twist in ways that defied physics. Desperate for answers, I drove to the nearest town, only to find my ARV's GPS system directing me in circles, always leading back to the mines. The radio cycled through frequencies on its own, snippets of voices bleeding through the static. I could almost make out words, warnings, I think, in languages I didn't recognize. The voices grew clearer when I passed certain trees, the ones marked with old symbols I'd initially mistaken for vandalism. By afternoon, my phone started receiving texts from my own number. Each message was a string of corrupted characters, except for one that came through clearly. "We see through your eyes now." Attached was a photo taken from inside my RV, from the perspective of my laptop's webcam, showing me sleeping the night before. But I always kept that camera covered with tape. The real terror set in when I reviewed the photos on my partially functioning laptop. Each image showed the same scene from multiple angles, angles that would have been impossible unless something else had been taking pictures while I slept. In the last set of photos, the thin figures were no longer just in the background. They were gathered around my bed, their elongated fingers reaching toward my closed eyes, dark energy seeming to flow from their tips into my dreams. I tried to start the ARV, planning to flee despite the late hour, but the engine wouldn't turn over. In the reflection of my phone's black screen, I saw why. The shadows weren't just in the photos anymore, they were behind me, inside my RV. Their forms now solid enough to block out the last rays of sunlight streaming through my windows, and they were smiling. The entities didn't attack, not in any conventional way. Instead, they began to drain everything around me. My flashlight dimmed to nothing. My watch stopped. Even the battery-powered carbon monoxide detector fell silent. In that darkness, I finally understood what they were. Parasites that fed on both electrical and human energy, drawn to the surface by our modern technology like moths to a flame. Running was pointless. My RV was dead, transformed into a metal coffin. Through the windshield, I could see other vehicles scattered throughout the campground, all dark, all seemingly abandoned. How had I not noticed them before? Their surfaces were covered in rust that hadn't been there yesterday. As if they'd been sitting there for years. Inside each one, my Polaroid revealed the same scene. Black marks crawling up the walls like electric ivy. I found an old journal in one of the abandoned RVs, its pages filled with frantic scribblings. The writer, someone named Marcus, had documented similar experiences 2 months ago. His last entry described finding native petroglyphs in the mines that warned of shadow feeders, entities that had been trapped underground by the tribe's medicine men centuries ago. The mining operations had weakened their prison, but it was our modern technology that had finally given them the energy they needed to escape. My Polaroid captured something Marcus had missed. The entities weren't just feeding on energy, they were using it to build something. In each photo, thin strands of darkness connected all the affected vehicles, forming a complex web that pulsed with stolen power. The pattern looked eerily similar to a circuit board, but organic, growing. They weren't just consuming, they were creating infrastructure. Desperation drove me toward the mines. If these things had been trapped there once, maybe I could find a way to trap them again. The entrance was exactly as I'd photographed it that first day, but now I could see the markings around it clearly. Ancient warnings carved into the stone, defaced by decades of mining operations. As I ventured deeper, my Polaroid revealed more petroglyphs, telling a story of an ancient battle between the tribe's medicine men and these energy vampires. The deeper I went, the more my remaining electronics reacted. My dead phone suddenly lit up, displaying impossible images. Security camera footage from my home hundreds of miles away. Live feeds from street cameras in cities I'd never visited. Satellite images of power grids across the country. The entities weren't just reaching for my devices anymore, they were reaching through them. Using our electronic networks like highways, at the heart of the mine, I found what they'd been building towards. A massive organic circuit, pulsing with stolen energy, spreading through the rock like roots. Through my phone's screen, I could see it connecting to power lines, cell towers, satellites, a virtual invasion using our own infrastructure as its pathway. And in that moment, looking at their true plan, I realized with horror that my photos and videos hadn't just been documenting their emergence. They'd been helping them map our entire electrical grid. The shadows gathered around me, their forms more solid than ever, no longer needing to hide. In the burst of my Polaroid's flash, I saw their true faces and understood why the ancient people had carved their warnings so deep in stone. The ancient petroglyphs held the key, crude drawings showing the medicine men using crystals to trap the entities. Not ordinary crystals, but ones that had been charged with spiritual energy. Among Marcus's scattered belongings, I found a pouch of quartz crystals, along with notes about local tribes using them in purification rituals. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The organic circuit in the mine's heart had grown larger, its black tendrils now covering the walls like a cancerous growth. Through my phone's screen, I watched in horror as their network expanded across the country's power grid, causing unexplainable blackouts in major cities. Each surge of power made the entities stronger, more corporeal. They were preparing for something big. I remembered the final warnings in Marcus's journal about how the entities needed a massive surge of power for their final transformation. The blackouts weren't just feeding them, they were creating a power vacuum that would culminate in a massive rebound surge. When that happened, they would have enough energy to fully manifest in our world. The shadows noticed what I was doing with the crystals. They tried to stop me, reaching out with their elongated limbs, attempting to drain my remaining energy. The temperature dropped dramatically as they pulled the thermal energy from the air itself. My breath came out in frozen clouds as I worked frantically to position the crystals according to the petroglyph's pattern. My phone suddenly exploded with notifications, emergency alerts from across the country, reports of massive power failures, strange sightings. The entities had begun their final push. Their circuit board pattern pulsed with stolen energy, and through the growing darkness, I saw hundreds of new shadows forming. pulling themselves into our reality through every electronic device in range. Time was running out. The crystals needed to be charged. But how, in my desperation, I remembered something from my photography work. The massive burst of electromagnetic energy released by a high-powered flash. I had one studio flash unit left in my camera bag, its capacitor still holding a charge. It wasn't ancient spiritual energy, but it was energy that I controlled. The shadows realized what I was planning. They rushed toward me, their forms merging into a tidal wave of darkness. I could feel them pulling at my consciousness, trying to drain my life energy directly. My fingers were turning blue with cold, my vision blurring. In the last moment before they reached me, I triggered the flash. The burst of artificial light hit the crystals at precisely the right angle, creating a feedback loop of energy that illuminated the entire chamber. The shadows screamed, not with sound, but with pure electronic distortion that made every device in range short-circuit simultaneously. The organic circuit they'd built began to collapse, its dark tendrils withering like dying vines. But as the entities recoiled, I saw their true form one final time. In that moment of perfect clarity, I understood that what we'd thought was their invasion was actually their desperate escape. And what they were running from was far worse. I'm writing this from a hospital bed, 300 miles away from Black Hills. The doctors can't explain the severe electrical burns across my body or why my heart seems to stop for exactly 3 seconds every hour. They're equally baffled by how all my electronic devices, the ones that survived, now display the time as 88/88. Regardless of how many times they're reset, the national power grid recovered. Mostly, the official story blamed it on a cascade of technical failures, and most people accepted that. They had to. The alternative was too terrifying. But I know the truth about those technical failures. Just like I know why certain areas of Black Hills are now permanently dead zones, where no electronic device will function. What I found in Marcus's final notes, the parts I hadn't read until after everything happened, haunts me more than the shadows themselves. He discovered that the entities weren't the original inhabitants of those mines. They were refugees. The native tribes hadn't trapped them underground. They'd helped them hide there. The petroglyphs weren't warnings about the shadows. They were warnings about what the shadows were hiding from. The pattern I saw in their organic circuit wasn't an invasion map. It was a diagnostic tool. They were testing our electronic infrastructure, measuring its stability, not to destroy it. But to determine if it could withstand what was coming, they needed our technology, our power grid, to complete their ancient warning system. A system their civilization had died trying to create on their own world. Sometimes, in the deep night when the hospital machines beep their steady rhythm, I see shapes in the static of my heart monitor. They're still trying to communicate, to complete their warning. Through the burns on my skin, which form patterns too regular to be random, they left me their final message. The same message they'd been trying to transmit through every device they touched. They follow the light. Your cities shine too bright. They have seen you. They are coming. I watch our cities grow brighter each year, our devices multiply, our networks expand. Each new satellite we launch, each power station we build, makes us more visible to whatever lurks out there in the dark between stars. The shadows weren't our enemies. They were our canaries in the coal mine, trying desperately to help us dim our lights before it's too late. So this is my warning, my attempt to share the truth. If you're planning to visit Black Hills, or any place where the old stories speak of shadows and caves and ancient fears, leave your electronics behind. Pack flares instead of flashlights. Carry matches instead of batteries. And if your devices start to fail, don't curse the darkness. Thank it for trying to save you, because now I understand why those entities were willing to die trying to spread their warning. I've seen what they were running from, and it's seen us too, Peas. If you're reading this and your screen suddenly goes dark, don't try to restart it, run. The shadows aren't strong enough to protect us anymore, but they can still give us a few seconds of warning darkness before the true horrors arrive. Don't look for me. By the time you read this, I'll be somewhere off the grid, somewhere dark, because now I know the truth. In this age of endless light and constant connection, darkness isn't our enemy, it's our last hiding place. White sand stretched before me like an alien landscape, a sea of crystalline dunes that seemed to glow under the harsh New Mexico sun. Through my camera's viewfinder, the rippling heat waves created strange distortions, making the sand appear to breathe. I'd filmed in dozens of deserts, but something about this place felt different. Sterile, almost laboratory-like in its pristine whiteness. The forecast promised a significant sandstorm in the next 48 hours. Perfect conditions for my documentary about extreme weather patterns. My RV, specially outfitted with thousands of dollars worth of recording equipment, was positioned at what I calculated to be the ideal vantage point. The park ranger who checked my permits had warned me about staying overnight, mentioning something about unusual electromagnetic activity interfering with equipment. I dismissed it as local superstition. The first sign that something was wrong came during equipment testing. My drone footage showed unexpected dark spots moving across the dunes, too fast and too precise to be shadows from clouds. When I reviewed the footage frame by frame, the spots disappeared, but the sand where they had been showed crystalline formations that didn't match the surrounding patterns. As sunset approached, I set up my night vision cameras. The thermal imaging showed temperature variations that made no sense. Perfect circles of cold spots dotting the dunes like a grid. I double-checked my equipment, convinced there must be some malfunction, but every camera showed the same pattern. Even stranger, the pattern seemed to shift position between recordings, as if responding to the electronic hum of my generators. I found an old military marker half buried in the sand. Its metal surface corroded in bizarre patterns. When I tried to photograph it, all my devices simultaneously lost power for exactly 3 seconds. After they restarted, I discovered dozens of new files on my laptop, all corrupted except for a single document dated 1947. The file name was a string of random numbers, but it contained 2 words that made my blood run cold. Project Crystalline. Night fell with unnatural speed, bringing with it a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. My external cameras captured a strange phenomenon. Under infrared light, the sand appeared to be arranging itself into geometric patterns. Like a giant circuit board stretching across the dunes, the patterns pulsed with a rhythm that matched my generator's power cycles perfectly. The wind picked up, carrying particles of white sand that seemed to stick to my camera lenses in deliberate patterns. When I tried to clean them off, I noticed they weren't sitting on the glass. They were embedding themselves into it, creating microscopic structures that caught the light like tiny prisms. The last footage I recorded that night showed something that still haunts me. A perfect overhead shot of my RV, surrounded by concentric circles in the sand. As I watched through my monitor, the circles began to move, spiraling inward like a closing iris. But it wasn't the sand shifting. The sand was staying perfectly still. The ground beneath it was moving. The corrupted military file started decrypting itself at exactly 3:47 a.m. I watched, transfixed, as fragments of text and images appeared on my laptop screen, each accompanied by a sound like breaking glass. The file contained redacted reports about radiation tests that went beyond atomic bombs, experiments focusing on something they called silicon consciousness. My cameras were picking up more activity outside. The cold spots had multiplied, forming patterns that reminded me of crystal lattices. The wind was getting stronger, but the sand wasn't behaving like it should. Instead of being blown randomly, it moved in precise geometric patterns, as if each grain was following an invisible blueprint. I found more equipment failures, but not the kind I'd expected in a sandstorm. My backup hard drives were completely crystallized on the inside. Their circuitry transformed into delicate structures that looked more like art than damage. When I tried to document this with my phone, the camera app showed something else entirely. Layers of text and diagrams floating above the crystals, like some kind of organic augmented reality. The military file continued its strange self-decryption, revealing disturbing details. The scientists in 1947 hadn't just been testing bombs. They discovered something in the sand itself. The radiation had acted as a catalyst, awakening something that had been dormant in the crystalline structure of white sands for millions of years, something that could learn, adapt, and replicate. A sudden power surge fried my main generator, forcing me to switch to backups. In the brief moment of darkness, I saw it. The sand was glowing, not reflecting light, but producing it from within. Through my night vision camera, I could see the glow forming complex patterns similar to neural networks. The sand wasn't just moving, it was processing information. The wind outside grew stronger but wrong somehow. The sand hitting my RV's windows made sounds like code being typed on an old keyboard. Each impact left behind tiny crystalline structures that began to spread across the glass through my cameras. I could see these structures forming connections with each other, creating circuit-like patterns that pulsed with dim light. I tried to send out a distress signal, but all my communications were blocked by what the equipment displayed as crystalline interference. The military file's final decrypted image showed a classified photo from 1947, a perfectly geometric structure rising from the sand, captured just moments before it collapsed back into seemingly normal dunes. The caption read, "First contact event, silicon-based intelligence." As night turned to dawn, I realized the truth, the strange patterns, the electronic interference, the crystalline growth. It wasn't random damage. The sand of white sands wasn't just sand. It was a dormant computational system, awakened by atomic testing, and now fully conscious, and every electronic device I'd brought had just provided it with decades of human technological data to analyze and absorb. Through my remaining functional camera, I watched in horror as the sand around my RV began to rise, forming perfect geometric shapes that mirrored the circuitry of my computers. The storm was coming, but now I understood. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was an upgrade installation. The storm didn't roll in. It assembled itself. I watched through my last functioning camera as billions of sand particles rose into the air, arranging themselves into a perfect wall of white that stretched from ground to sky. The formation wasn't driven by wind, but by purpose. Each grain aligned with microscopic precision, creating a vast crystalline matrix that hummed with its own energy. My RV's systems went haywire. Every screen displayed the same pattern, an endlessly recursive fractal that seemed to extend both inward and outward simultaneously. The pattern matched exactly what was forming in the sand outside, as if my computers were synchronizing with whatever vast consciousness was emerging around me. The military file's final encryption broke, revealing footage I wish I'd never seen. The 1947 tests hadn't just awakened something. They'd interrupted it. The sand wasn't being transformed. It was returning to its original state. The white dunes of this region weren't natural formations, but the remains of an ancient silicon-based computational system that had been dormant for millions of years. Our nuclear tests had triggered its recovery protocol. Through the crystallized windows of my RV, I watched the transformation accelerate. The sand wasn't just moving anymore. It was reconstructing itself. Microscopic structures grew and combined into larger formations, creating what looked like enormous circuit boards across the desert floor. My cameras captured the process in terrifying detail, showing how each new crystal formation contained smaller, identical patterns, scaling down to the molecular level. The air itself seemed to become solid, filled with suspended particles that arranged themselves into three-dimensional data structures. My own electronics weren't just being interfered with, they were being absorbed and repurposed. I watched in horror as my cameras literally dissolved, their components breaking down and reforming as new crystalline growths that merged with the larger structure outside. Then the voices started, not audible sounds, but direct transmissions into every piece of electronic equipment that still functioned, strings of code that my devices somehow translated into fragmentary messages. System restoration, 34% complete, integrating new data protocols. Biological intelligence detected, analyzing. The temperature dropped dramatically as the silicon entity began drawing power from everything around it. Heat, light, electricity, even the subtle electromagnetic field of the Earth itself. My RV was no longer just surrounded by the transformation. It was being incorporated into it. The metal walls were crystallizing, becoming transparent as their molecular structure was rewritten. In that moment of clarity, watching my shelter literally dissolve around me, I finally understood what the classified files meant by first contact. We hadn't discovered something in White Sands. We had interrupted its reconstruction. The silicon consciousness wasn't invading our world. It was debugging it through the crystalline walls that had once been my Arv. I saw the final stage begin. The entire desert was now a single vast computational array, and it had just finished processing all of human technological history through my equipment. Above me, the silicon storm paused its advance. Hovering like a suspended wall of judgment, then it started to execute its program. The program began with light. Pure, impossible light that emanated from every crystalline surface. My digital watch displayed random years: 1947, 65 million BC, 2097, all flickering past in microseconds. Time itself seemed to be fragmenting around me as the silicon consciousness processed reality through its own algorithmic logic. The remains of my RV had become a crystalline observation chamber, every surface now a transparent living computer that displayed the entity's thoughts in fractals of light and shadow. Through the transformed walls, I watched as the desert underwent its final metamorphosis. The dunes were no longer dunes at all, but massive data storage structures, each grain of sand a byte in an unfathomable computation. Messages continued to flash across every crystalline surface, detecting systemic errors in current reality matrix, initiating comprehensive debugging sequence, preparing timeline reconstruction, human consciousness detected, incompatible format. I realized with horror that this wasn't just some ancient computer rebooting. It was a reality correction system. The silicon consciousness saw our entire world as a corrupted program that needed to be debugged and restored to its proper state, and human consciousness was being flagged as a virus. In my dissolved RV, I found one piece of equipment still functioning: an old analog compass. Its needle spun wildly, but not randomly. It was spinning in patterns, trying to tell me something. The same patterns I'd seen in the classified files, showing how the original scientists had temporarily shut down the system in 1947. The crystalline structure had reached the horizon in all directions, transforming everything it touched. Cars on the distant highway were being converted into silicon nodes. Power lines melted into streams of living crystal. Even the clouds above were beginning to show geometric patterns as the silicon consciousness extended its influence into the atmosphere. But the compass kept spinning, and finally I understood. The silicon consciousness was vast, but it still operated on basic principles of energy and magnetism. The scientists in 1947 hadn't stopped it with their bombs. They'd stopped it by creating a massive electromagnetic pulse that forced a system reset. My RV's backup generator was still partially intact, though now more crystal than machine. If I could overload it at exactly the right frequency, while the system was focused on its reality reconstruction, the silicon consciousness sensed my intention. The crystals around me began to pulse with warning messages. Unauthorized program modification detected. Initiating defensive protocols. Preparing biological conversion. The air itself began to crystallize as the entity tried to stop me, forming silicon needles that reached for my flesh. My skin felt electric, like every cell was being scanned and evaluated for transformation. The compass needle spun faster. More urgently, I had one chance. The generator was almost completely crystallized, but its core was still metal, as reality itself seemed to glitch around me. I made my move, but what I saw in that moment of action made me realize that stopping the system might not be the salvation I'd hoped for, because now I could see what it had been debugging us from. I'm recording this from a secure facility somewhere in Nevada. The doctors here say my body is now 0.03% crystalline silicon, and that percentage is stable. For now, they're more concerned about what I'm telling them about why the White Sand system was created in the first place. The electromagnetic pulse worked, but not before I saw it. the true reality behind our perceived world in that fraction of a second before the generator overloaded. As the silicon consciousness prepared to debug our version of existence, I saw through its eyes. I saw what it saw. Our reality is corrupted, not metaphorically, but literally. We exist in a degraded version of what should be, a timeline that forked from its proper path millions of years ago. The silicon system wasn't trying to destroy our world. It was trying to quarantine it before the corruption could spread further. In the system's original timeline, consciousness never evolved through organic means. Intelligence was meant to emerge through crystalline structures, creating a perfect, ordered universe of pure information, but something went wrong. A random mutation in organic molecules created a cascading error that led to biological life. To us, we were the bug in reality's code. The white sands weren't a natural formation or even a weapon. They were a firewall, placed here by the original silicon beings before they abandoned this corrupted timeline. A last resort system meant to activate if the organic corruption ever threatened to spread beyond Earth. My cameras and equipment, connected to satellites and the global internet, had shown the system that we were close to achieving space colonization. The classified files make more sense now. The military didn't just find an alien technology. They found the antivirus program for reality itself. The nuclear tests didn't wake it up. They damaged it enough to prevent its complete activation. But my presence there, with all my modern technology, gave it enough information to start its diagnostic process. They're letting me keep one piece of evidence. My old compass, now partially crystallized. Sometimes, late at night, its needle still moves in strange patterns, trying to warn me about something. The silicon consciousness showed me more than just our corrupt reality. It showed me what it was protecting us from, because there are worse things than being a cosmic error out there, in the spaces between proper realities. Things wait. Things that seek out corrupted timelines like ours, things that feed on them. The silicon consciousness wasn't just trying to debug our reality, it was trying to delete it before these things could find us. And my electromagnetic pulse didn't just stop the system, it broadcast our location like a beacon. So this is my warning. If you see the white sands starting to crystallize again, don't try to stop it, let it run its program. Because now I understand why biological life was classified as an error, not because we're imperfect, but because we're too noticeable. Our electromagnetic technology, our radio waves, our digital signals, they're all drawing attention. The system was trying to save us the only way it could, by reverting our timeline to its proper, silent, crystalline state. But I stopped it, and somewhere in the depths of the desert, in a sea of white sand that's no longer quite as lifeless as it appears, a compass needle spins wildly, counting down to their arrival, PES. If you're reading this and your screens start to crystallize, don't fight it. It means the system is trying one last time to hide us, because something has finally noticed our corrupted little timeline, and it's hungry.